something I continue to use for my own self, but I thought I would read one of those devotionals. Is something that, as I was looking back through it, it really stuck out to me again. So I sometimes wonder what the lives of shepherds looked like before the fateful night the sky lit up with angels. They were third shift workers engaged in manual labor, honest enough work, but smelly and not too glamorous. Perhaps not the kind of work we would encourage our kids to get into these days. It was the kind of work that disappeared into the background of the community. Most people probably went to the market to get wool, meat, or milk, and never had to deal with long hours and achy joints and rancid smells that are a part of raising sheep. The shepherds probably didn't get much thanks for their hard work. They were ordinary men with rather ordinary lives. And then God decided they were going to be the first ones to know about Jesus. I'm sure Mary would rather have had her parents there, or at least the wise men who had the sense to bring some nice gifts. I know when my daughters were born and folks came to visit us in the hospital, we had no strangers and no stench brought into the room. But Mary got the shepherds, who had made great haste in going straight from the fields to the stable. The stink and the filth from the sheep and the hills lingered in the air everywhere they went, and any concept of visiting hours was thrown out. Complete strangers to Mary and Joseph, they come unbidden to worship Jesus. The shepherds can teach us something about how we should come before God. Luke tells us that they went with haste to find their Savior. There's no time to clean up when you have a chance to meet Jesus. Give up all pretense of appearing decent and respectable before God. Just make sure you get to see him. Often our hearts feed us lies about needing to look a certain way to be acceptable with others or before God. The truth is that God knows us fully and completely, and no amount of washing can clean the stench of our sin. It is also true that in Christ, God sees us as being washed and cleansed and purified in a way that we could never accomplish on our own. The shepherds teach us that we can bring all of our stinky selves to Jesus. Like the shepherds, we wait for a Savior and not for the time when we get ourselves cleaned up. The cleaning we need is found only in him. In this Advent season, rejoice with the shepherds that our waiting is over. So, I like Christmas all year round, but we'll get started early because that would be good. Yes. Heavenly Father, we are grateful to be gathered and to be learning for the hearts and minds you've given us to see your heart more nearly, more dearly, clearly, for our minds to be turned towards the things that you would have us know and see and do, Father. And so we pray a blessing upon tonight, upon the words spoken and those who will be sharing and the chance we have to grow and learn together. And just pray this now in Jesus' name. Amen.
I've only done it once in my pastoral life, but one year, Sunday fell on the 25th of June. And I thought, hey, let's have an Australian Christmas. And we sang Christmas carols and we read the Christmas story. And I thought, now think how different it would be if, and we talked about the meaning of Christmas and so forth. Hi, how did it go? Good. All right. The pageant. Good. Well, tonight we're going to turn another corner. The first two units were about, hey Todd, were units about getting to know the city, and there's still some of that you're doing, and also about culture. And you got all kinds of cool props these days. Good to see you. And so these first two units have been wrapped around each other as we try to come in from all sorts of different angles to talk about culture. So we read Patty Lane's book. We We have brought people from some other cultures to come and talk, or people that have worked in other cultures. You've been out in the neighborhoods watching cultures and also getting to know the neighborhood a little bit better and seeing how cultures interact, and that's what your assignment was about. And so through this whole thing, it's been we've tried to come at this. We played the culture game. We've come at the concept of culture from a lot of different ways. The first year that we did this class, we covered culture in 1 hour. And we realized over the last 24 years that we needed a whole lot more background in culture, because so much of the stuff that we run into that we can't understand deals with the culture. And the other big chunk of why we keep running into stuff we can't understand is because it's the complexity of the city and all the stuff in the city, from the way money flows in and money flows out, and politics and gangs and construction and federal, state, and local policy, and almost 200 years of decisions people have made that create the city to be what the city is. So we've been able to touch on some of those things, but again, the purpose of the class is to drive some nails into the wall that you can start hanging your own studies as you ask the question, why? Why does this work this way? Why does this culture work this way? And if goals again for this class are to give you a background in these 7 different areas, and to do it in such a way that we make you think, we try to make you aware of some things, and we also try to set you up so that you can, you will instinctively teach yourself. One of the best things that you can learn to do in life, and this has been one of the great gifts in my life, is that I had a dad who was always very curious, and he was always wondering about stuff. And one of the ways that God has worked in my life is to raise questions that I can't answer. Sometimes they're faith questions even, or Bible questions. What is this? How does this work? And sometimes it's taken years, even decades, to come up with the answer, but they were major turning points of my understanding of God, of the Bible, and so forth. But having the question there and being curious and letting a question fester and work and bubble, and I think of yeast. Questions are good yeast. And those are the things that end up creating the deeper answers. You keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and learning and learning and learning. Nobody's ever going to learn everything about Minneapolis, let alone the cities of the world. There's just too much complexity. But the more we learn, the better we understand the people and the location. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's what we've been up to. And tonight we're going to turn to the 3rd chapter, the 3rd unit, and that's going to be called something I called Entrepreneuring the Church, which is how do you start on bare dirt with no resources, and notice a need, notice an access point, see God's access point in the situation, and then how do you begin on bare dirt to put something together? Now, I just learned, 10 or 15 years ago, it finally hit me that God had been preparing me for the kind of work that I've done all my life from the time I was a tiny boy. I grew up in Little Canada. We had 1-acre lots. We had 6 1-acre lots almost. Oh, well, they're almost 1 acre. We were over 5 acres. And I grew up on the end of a dead-end street, and I was an only child. And I didn't even know there were any boys even close to my age till I went to kindergarten. And so I didn't have a lot of playmates, but as soon as I got to kindergarten, I got phone calls. I got phone numbers. Danny Caker, Roger Eddy, and the kids in the neighborhood. And if I wanted to play, if I wanted to, see, they all had brothers and sisters and cousins, and there were kids in their part of the block. For the block south of us was 2/3 of a mile long. It was just the way things were set up. So if I wanted to play baseball or if I wanted to play anything, I got on the phone call and I organized the group to do, hey guys, let's 1 o'clock, let's play ball. And so I started, I had my own phone book when I was a first grader, with everybody's phone number in there. And so God was preparing me for a lot of the things I've done since, because most of my work has been about bringing people together around an idea and saying, hey kids, let's do this. And that's all it is to be a leader. And I'm still a little kid that likes to just bring people together and around an idea, and that's how I learned how to do it. And so my whole ministry has been that of rebuilding ministries other people have given up on in difficult settings. And one of my friends calls me the patron saint of lost causes, but everybody needs a hobby. So anyway, what we're going to talk about tonight is some of the stuff that we're going to have about, about 7 hours, maybe a little less, talking about this thing of how do you start on bare dirt and build something. So tonight's the transition, and you guys all went out and you did some observations. And I would like you to just jump in and talk about some of your experiences. What were some of the things that you experienced, and how was it different, and how was it cool, and how was it scary, and how was it funny, and how was it boring, and who did you see, and what did you do, and so forth?
Starting with me? No, that was I'm about to reach into my food bag.
Good thing you're not at an auction. You'd have just bought something. No.
But I can talk first.
I've done that. Do you want to talk? Okay.
Wait, you want to talk about the observation thing that we did?
What did you tell them what your experience
Okay.
what you learned?
Well, we went to the hospital today, actually, and we saw a lot of the signs and directions. We even were lost for most of it, and we understand the signs, but a lot of the signs were all in English, except for when you got into the elevator where they were. There was a translation of a bunch of different languages, and it said translators available if needed or something like that. They had translators, but you had to get to the elevator to know that there is translators. So that was interesting. And then this is something actually that I've experienced in my past is the homeless shelter stuff. That's something that my family has been involved with, not serving, but had to take meals from homeless shelters before, because we literally had nothing a lot of the time. And so even in high school and stuff, I remember feeling humiliated kind of, but also feeling like I was less than, because the workers kind of made themselves look higher up than everybody else, sort of. I didn't ever go into any here, but I remember that feeling too of just knowing that, yeah, I feel like I just am not worth anything. And they kind of half-heartedly gave me a bowl of slop, basically. That's basically what we were given, but it was free and it was food, so we had to have it. So yeah, that was just a little bit, I guess.
What did that hospital feel like to you? That hospital feels different than the other hospitals in the
Yeah.
I get to know hospitals.
Yeah. I guess it was just there was a lot of different people from different backgrounds. Did we even see another white person there?
Yeah, there's a lot of different.
There was one or two, but pretty much everybody else was different cultures and different backgrounds. So it kind of didn't really feel like where I'm from, you go to the hospital and it's super high class and high tech, and it really kind of just felt a basic hospital, and kind of felt, yeah, a lot more welcoming, I think, too, than some hospitals, because a lot of them in Fargo area, you have to have a code to get anywhere, and you have to have escorts, but we just wandered around the hospital and were able to do that, and nobody asked any questions. Nobody stopped us, or we looked lost most of the time, and nobody asked if we needed help. And so that was also kind of I felt kind of a little bit out of place too, because I wasn't there for a reason. And then also was lost, so I felt like didn't really like care if I got to my destination, you know, sort of. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
And did you do something besides the hospital?
No. So the only one we did was the hospital. But yeah, just like looking back to that. So that on my list actually, I did that hospital one, and then I looked back a little bit to my this like times when my family did need assistance in that area, and then also this weekend at the pageant, I saw a lot of like the judges, for example. This wasn't on the list, but like I kind of used it as one of my cultural experiences, sort of, because the judges they picked. So out of the top 15, or like there was 44 women competing, and they picked the top 15, but the top 14 were all white women, and the last woman was a black woman, and we're pretty sure like she was not like the other women were like your typical like model looking woman, but like she was like pretty curvy woman, like, and it was like she didn't fit the picture of what they picked in all these other ladies, and it kind of like really looked like to the audience. I asked a lot of people about it, and it looked like to the audience that they were just doing that to make sure they had cultural diversity. But all of the judges were also white, so that was like actually kind of like hurtful to me too. I was like, are you serious? Like that's how you're gonna treat this lady? She's the 15th place, plus she knows that this is the reason she's in the top 15. Like they just needed, for the cameras and the TV sake of things, to have cultural diversity. So yeah, that was pretty hurtful, I think, for her too. Yeah.
Okay, who else would like to share a little bit about your experience?
Do you want to?
You all should have a chance to do so.
I'll go, I guess. So yeah, we went to the hospital, and I kind of went back on like some experiences that I was on the bus and stuff like that. And I know for a lot, at first, when I first moved down here, I used the internet a lot to kind of plan my rides because I didn't know how they were connected. And then I just like to double check, I went back on the website to see if there was any, like if you could find it in other languages, and I couldn't. Maybe I was like misnavigating on the website, but I'm sure there is. You'd think that there would be some kind of setting to see whether you could get it in different languages as far as Metro Transit goes.
Wales in Spanish, English, and Hmong.
Okay.
Spanish, English, Somali, and Hmong.
Okay, so yeah, then I couldn't find it, but I figured it would be on there somewhere.
I don't know if the buses are.
The bus, oh, that's for the light rail? Sure, sure. And like as far as like navigating and like the different lists of where the bus is, when the bus is coming, and whatever, I think that's pretty, like if you're from a different culture, it wouldn't be too hard because of like, it's just usually, you know, a couple of letters and a couple numbers. And so once you see the bus you're looking for coming, I think you could kind of match those up and to see and make sure you get on the right bus. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And then, you know, being able to use different languages, and you wanted to set up a ride, I think if you needed to get around from another culture, and you're from another culture, you spoke a different language, I think that it may be a little obviously a little harder than if you spoke English, Spanish, or Hmong, but I think it's still possible. But yeah, so yeah.
How did you feel when you were? What were your experiences with people and so forth?
Yeah, so usually, like, when I lived in Minneapolis, I usually rode the 5 or the 2. And so there was a very wide range of cultures and ethnicities. On the 5, I experienced a lot more like, you never know what's going to happen kind of thing.
What's the route of the 5?
5 goes to downtown and then to the Mall of America. So Chicago Avenue mainly. Yep. And then the 2 kind of goes Franklin. And I don't know where else it goes. I think it turns and goes to the college too, but I can't remember exactly. So So yeah, I mean, it was riding the 5 was kind of uncomfortable at first because I was just like new to the city, new to the different ethnicities, and like it was just a little more wild than what I was used to. But I got used to it after a while, and it wasn't too bad.
Mass transit, we're not used to it. See, I've always had a job when I have no idea where I'm going to. I plan out my day ahead of time. Plan out my day ahead of time, my job, and then I know every day that 40% of my job is just going to happen. And it's going to be stuff I can't plan for. Somebody in the hospital, emergency phone call, whatever. And so I have not been in a position to use much mass transit because I have to get here from Roseville, and to do that I probably have to go to St. Paul and through St. Paul over to here and so forth. It just isn't well. You've got to organize your life around mass transit in our cities. Now, when we were in Florence a few weeks ago in Italy, I got pickpocketed, lost my only time in my life I've ever lost my wallet, lost all my pictures, lost all the credit cards, lost my Social Security card, which I probably shouldn't have been carrying, and a bunch of, I still don't have everything replaced yet. I'm expecting to find my banking account completely drained. You're laughing at something. Did I say something about the? No, that's okay. Oh no. Well, I've made it through my adult life without ever losing my wallet or misplaced my keys many times. But I've never completely lost it all the way through, and so fortunately I didn't have everything in there, but anyway, whatever. Yeah, and so we were very much, our antenna were way out every time we were on one of these. Plus we didn't know how, between canal boats in Venice and trying to get on the right one and get off at the right stop, and you kind of get that deer in the headlights look because you really don't understand what's going on. And posso, and my Italian is not. I kind of spoke Spitalian with Spanish, but it was. You really kind of feel naked when you don't have, you're several thousand miles away from home, and all your credit cards and everything are gone. It's like, now what? But fortunately, Brenda had different cards and different numbers and so forth, so she was able to take care of me. All right, who's would like to share something about their experience? Thank you, both.
I know Janet went out for dinner with her husband and had a wonderful date. So I went to Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, one of the churches that we've worked with. Mike, where's Mike? Mike and I went there, and
Where's that located?
38th and like 5 blocks west of Hiawatha, just by the light rail station. And it's very much a probably as close to a stereotypical black church experience as you can have. The pastor's the president of the State Baptist Convention, which is missionary Baptist denomination here in Minnesota. And so from worship to preaching style, there is very much a cultural thing. And we've had their choir come before, but they didn't have the choir sing. They had a worship team, and there's an interaction in a lot of black churches between whoever's speaking in the organ or the choir, and so I've always really enjoyed that. It just it engages you in a different way. I think there's a conversation, there's a dialogue between the pastor and the choir, pastor and the people in the pews, and so that dialogue is really an engaging thing. And what was that guy kind of just across the aisle? He ended up walking around, but he had one line he kept. There's a guy that had he kind of cycled through his call and response things as the pastor went through the sermon. And
They just say, as a traditionally taught Lutheran pastor, when we get people that come and visit from many said there's a response in this. We've also had a couple times when inebriated people have come in and decide they want to kind of take over the sermon.
They do a similar thing. Yeah, filled with the Spirit or filled with the spirits. So I actually really I enjoy that a lot. When I do teaching and training or when I've spoken, I prefer some cues from. It doesn't have to be call and response in the same way, but
You get used to it, it's fun.
yeah, well, I kind of need some affirmation. I'm a very needy speaker, and so I appreciate some affirmation from the crowd. So I really enjoyed that. They're definitely so they have visitors stand up, and then basically you stay standing, and half the church comes around and greets you. And so that was definitely different. All the handshakes and hellos, and it was fun.
I'll piggyback on that thought. What stood out about that experience was in an individualistic culture, you think, okay, I want to kind of blend in with the crowd. I don't want to stand out. I don't want to be noticed because this church is about me. When you go and visit and they have you stand up and you're two of the three white people in the whole building, you're like, okay, I'm kind of standing out here. And then they'll shake your hand, and what I got to thinking about that is culturally, I think they're very much more focused on the group. And so if somebody had been new who wasn't welcomed, who wasn't made a big deal of, wasn't invited into the group in that sense, that could have been a slight to somebody. For me, it was like I didn't want that, but for somebody else, maybe they would have, that would have been a significant thing. We're now part of the group. Everyone gets to shake your hand. We all see that you're here. You're part of our group now. And so that was, it was interesting to experience it and then think as I'm going through it, okay, this is a good thing. It didn't necessarily feel great to be kind of singled out, but it was a good thing for that, for their culture.
I'm on the far extrovert end of things, and my wife is in the far introvert. So, the greeting time in church is like, yeah, let's go and shake as many hands as possible. Hi, how are you? Let's have a little talking. My wife's good. Please, don't touch me. I just want to talk to you. I don't touch me this part. Yeah, they're different cultures.
Yeah.
What was your second?
I didn't do a second one yet, but I will. We had a trip to Pennsylvania and some work projects that I just couldn't get to it. But I will one day.
I went to Jesus in the First City. Jesus in the City first. Just Jesus in the City, there we are. And I am the extreme introvert. So I did a lot of fretting in the car, just even to go in there, trying to figure out what door I should go in, and was I dressed appropriately, and all these things. And then finally I find my way in, and then I can't find the sanctuary. And then I sat in my car and tried to watch when people would come, thinking they'll show me where the door is. And nobody came. And it was like 5 minutes till the church is starting. I'm thinking, am I the only one going to be here? So all this anxiety to get inside, and finally I got inside, and there was nobody in there. The worship band was practicing, and I thought, am I intruding? Am I sitting in someone's seat? You know how you have reserved seats, so to speak. And nobody is there, and all of a sudden the worship band stopped singing, and people just came. I don't know where they came from, but there was only about 25 people there. No, there were no children and no teenagers and no elderly people that were there. And I come from a Scandinavian Lutheran church that's everything is really to the minute. They take 60 minutes and so you can have 3 minutes for this and 2 minutes for this and 7 minutes for this. And so it's very organized, and guests are, given water or tea or coffee. They're ushered in by an usher. You get a bulletin. You get a gift bag, and it's all of that. And so then this is just the opposite. And not that it was difficult for me, but it was just a very different experience than my own church. And like the visit, I was the only visitor. They all knew each other. There's only 25 of them. So when it comes to the time of let's greet each other, I had the line of 25 people to all welcome me. And I was just, I just don't want to be noticed. And here, how do you not be noticed when you're the only visitor there? But warmly welcomed. I mean, it was very sincere, very genuine, which that was very obvious. So It was very, it was a very typical service. I mean, they'd worship and the sermon and offering and things. But it was like someone in the audience decided they wanted to have testimony time. So they asked the pastor, can we have testimonies? And he just, sure. So then all of a sudden we had testimonies for a while, which was fine, but that would never happen in my church. I mean, never. That's out of the minutes that you would be allocated, so. And it was, I actually know Kristen, Hurt, and Norton were from my church. I didn't realize that they were at my church years ago, which I knew them from afar, so to speak. My other experience was going to North Minneapolis to the Salvation Army for the soup kitchen. And again, sitting in the car, just a wreck. My friend came with me. She was actually in worse shape than I was. I was trying to even get her out of the car. We were so upset that we were trying. Do we have the right clothes on? Should we be using resources that other people might need? Will they welcome us? We were just all these anxieties. And finally, we watched and we thought, well, we'll go in with a group of people so we won't be noticed. And right away, they all went to the gymnasium, and the office desk singled us out and said, "Can we help you?" And so I said, "Well, we're here for the meal," and it's that way. And so then we went in, and then there was no more staff except for the people that were serving the meal, and they had signs up about where you put your dishes, and once I got inside and I got my food, and then we sat down, well, we're noticing where to sit, and there was 8 tables just like these, and it was an elderly white group that all sat together. They knew each other, and they would welcome each other as they came to the table. And then there was a Native American couple sitting together, and then there were many single, or they were there alone, black men, and there were me, that we were just sitting by ourselves. So it again was all by almost age and race again, how everybody sort of seated themselves. But it was very quiet, people were just chatting, and then once we calmed down, it almost seemed just like a restaurant in there. And the staff was friendly. I heard people say thank you, and people tried to help me with the people that were eating, or even trying to help me put my dishes away, helping me where to put things. So it wasn't a very traumatic experience. It was actually pretty delightful. But what was obvious to me was that it wasn't just a place for people to come to get a meal, but it was really, I felt like these people were isolated, and so it was a place for them to connect. If they were alone all day, that they could at least come there and connect with somebody. So those are my thoughts.
How did it, for someone who's the eternal giver and constantly taking care of other people, how did it feel to be on the receiving end?
Awkward, for sure. Yeah. I kept thinking, I wonder if I should volunteer here. Is there any way that I could put money in the kettle? Or, I was trying to figure out ways to compensate for my being there, that I didn't take away resources. So, yeah, it was awkward.
So many of the experiences that you had us choose, I had already experienced overseas. So I was said, okay, let me be brave and try something I haven't. So I did go to for a free meal as well. I chose Dorothy Day Center in St. Paul. And I had the address, but driving down there, I was nervous and kind of scared, like, what is this really? Because I don't like first-time experiences anyway. I'm wondering what, and I get there, and the place isn't there anymore. There's a big new building, and I thought, well, let me just drive around the neighborhood. Maybe I'll find something. And just like a block or so away, there were homeless-looking people walking towards a building. So I found a parking place and started walking towards that, and I saw them going into this one place, and there was a man that came about the same time I did. I said, do you know where I can get a free meal? He said, yeah, right here. Come with me. So you had to register, and I had dressed down. I had no makeup. I had glasses. I had old clothes on, trying not to look too obvious. And you had to register first. There was 3 women at a desk, and so I let the man go first, and then I was alone. I said, you know, I have this class and this is one of my assignments. Is it okay for me to get this meal? And they kind of looked at me like, really? Well, that's kind of neat. Yeah, go. So this was not a nice looking place. You had to go down the hallway and stand in a single file line. And they'd let and there was people, mostly men, all different ethnicities, all different ages, not a clean place. And you'd walked downstairs to the basement where the dining room was. There was round tables, kind of messy, cafeteria line. And they had these blue plastic trays that had compartments. And when you got to the beginning of the line, the elderly white volunteers gave you a tray. Everybody got the exact same thing. And then a short while later, a volunteer gave a paper napkin and plastic fork. And then you just had to wait till you could find an empty seat at one of the tables. Most of the same food. Yeah, same food. This was the day before Thanksgiving. And so it looked like they had a special treat of pumpkin pie, but that was being handed out only to those who wanted it. And strangely, there were 2 security guards standing by the thing that was holding the pie. I don't know if that was coincidence or what. And some of the other diners, they were kind of like, yeah, that's a waste of our taxpayer money, the security guards watching pumpkin pie, and, you know, stuff like this. On my table, there was an elderly man that was very friendly and talked with me, 70-something. And then there was 2 African Americans and an Asian-looking younger woman who was very quiet. The 2 African American men were talking back and forth. But it was just kind of, some tables are very quiet, some were loud. I didn't know where to take my empty tray, so I had to watch the crowd and figured that out. But then when you walk out, it's dark and you're in a neighborhood you don't know. And anyway, I got safely. Yeah, 4:30 to 5:30. But I got safely home.
Was it kind of like down by St. Joe's Hospital? Or?
Yeah. And the other one was the ethnic. No. The other one was an ethnic restaurant, and so we chose, and this one I convinced my husband to come with. We went to the Himalayan restaurant on East Lake Street. So you walk in, and this was at like a late lunch. Walk in, and the restaurant is painted in yellows and golds, and there's Buddhas and Hindu gods and other type of artwork around that made you feel like you were entering into their part of the world. They had a buffet, which my husband ate. It was mostly Indian food, but since I had to try food I didn't know, I chose Himalayan coffee, a steamed dumpling type thing, and then Tibetan rice noodles. So the buffet, you could go right away and get it. And I waited patiently for my food, and I waited and waited and waited. And finally, I asked my waiter, "Do you have any idea when the food's coming?" He said, "Oh, I forgot." So he went and gave him the order, and they brought the coffee first. It had a very strong ginger taste and a spice that neither Abed or I knew what it was. Eventually we figured out it was a black cardamom, but very strong flavor that you have to get used to. The steamed dumplings were good, but then the rice noodles was in a broth that was full of this spice as well. So I maybe got half of it eaten because I just couldn't. They wore T-shirts that said "local, fresh, made from scratch," and the food tasted very good. The buffet food and things. There was people from all different backgrounds eating there. So it was for me, that was a pretty comfortable experience. I enjoyed it for the most part.
What made you feel like an outsider? What made you feel welcome?
In the restaurant, I didn't feel like an outsider because I've been in other cultures before. But there was just like, I wonder what this food is going to taste like. And then when I didn't like it, it was kind of like, oh, darn. And then the free meal, I just felt very much out of place. And came away feeling so grateful for a home and food and all of those things. I think if I knew somebody else in the group, it wouldn't have been so much, but not knowing anybody and
So I also went to a black church. It was a small black church in North Minneapolis, Good News Baptist Church. So you mentioned boring. So it was anything but boring. You know, it was, and it was a very participative experience and interactive. In fact, it was so participative when the pastor looked at me and he said, he told me to come up and pray for over the offering. So I came up. It's small, you know. So yeah, I went up. I'm like, it's like I went up and prayed for the offering. Yeah, he did. Yep. So I know his wife through some crew connections. Yep. And then there's titles in the black church. They're very important. You know, from pastor to bishop to apostle. So I haven't quite figured out all the titles, but it was pretty easy to recognize that's important. Yeah, and I think for me in a smaller church rather than maybe the Friendship Baptist experience, there was there was a little bit of skepticism towards my wife and I in terms of who are these folks, why are they here? But as I began to engage in conversations, you could just kind of sense the walls coming down. So I think as an introvert, it was like I needed to authentically engage with people. And as I did that, the walls came down, and there was a warmth that, when we left, people were just very kind to us. So we at the end, we came away from the conclusion that this crossing cultures is very taxing. So we were both tired after the experience. So then my second experience was there was a small group from my church went to visit the homeless camp here off of Hiawatha. So I went with them, and I kind of split off from the group and just kind of walked and talked and made some conversations. And I think, a few observations. One was, I kind of felt I've kind of crossed borders into countries traveling, but I almost felt like as we came in kind of the east side that you got the wall kind of on one side and the street and then these narrow openings. And then you kind of walk in and it's like a country and a culture of its own there. And there was a real sense of community, just observing the interactions. Speaking of authority structure, there seemed to be an informal but very real authority structure, because I was chatting with this one gentleman, and all of a sudden we sensed there was a little interpersonal conflict going on over here, and next thing you know, this woman walked up to this very unassuming gentleman who was in a conversation with other folks and kind of talked about what was going on, and he listened to her, and then he went with her over to the situation to bring some kind of resolution. So this man I was with, he said, well, he's the leader here. So I don't, I don't know all that was going on there, but there seemed to be an informal but very real leadership structure. People were generous towards each other. I just observed one man who had a really nice coat, and another man was in need. And I observed them talking, and this guy took his coat off and gave it to this other man, which was pretty profound to see that. And then, there was also, just along the same lines, even a sense of gratefulness. I had this awkward moment where this gentleman came up to me and asked me for change for a $10 bill. And I had just happened to put a bunch of ones in my wallet. So I'm pulling out my wallet in the dark, kind of fumbling, trying to make change. And then it's kind of like, man, this is awkward. And it's kind of like, okay, just give them, stop counting them and just. So I said, here, just quietly, and he looked at me and he thanked me, and you could even see him. He was tearing up. He was just so grateful. So I was, so there was a sincerity about the interaction that we had. So. I think in terms of implications, even seeing the Natives Against Heroin teepee there was, just seeing, and the little piece of land, and it's like, this is a complex situation, but in our, socioeconomic structure, land is part of power and privilege, and here these folks, predominantly Native American folks, were displaced, and here they are, on this piece of land, and just the injustice kind of it hit me in a more profound level, and even to think of the idea of even restitution of the land I live on. And it's like, how does this all work in terms of trying to make right this injustice? Yeah. So.
Yes. Well, coming to the United States was not really easy. Living in the United States with zero skills and language skills also. I remember my brother and I, we took the bus from California all the way to Minnesota. It was a long ride, like 2 days and 2 nights. And we didn't know how to communicate with the bus driver because it makes a lot of stops, and also you have to take another buses, not just like a layovers and stuff. And it was really strange because all the people that was sitting come and sit with us, and was like on and off, different types of people, and they would try to talk to us, and we just didn't know how to keep a conversation with them, with anybody. And coming to Minnesota, the snow was not a different situation. The cold, I don't know, you guys been in another country, it feels really weird when you're in another country because everything smells so different. The food is different. I remember the first time I have a burrito was here in the United States. Never had it in Mexico, and it's supposed to be Mexican, but it's not. Texas, maybe, I think, southern Texas. So living here in, I'm going to give a little bit of everything I wrote here. I came here to work with the laborers, 563 labor union, and also at work it was really hard. We just rely on other people to tell us what to do because other people that knew how to speak English, we didn't. And I was like, we just rely. It was. I remember one of those days I stepped into a nail and my foot started bleeding, so I went to the hospital. And that was another challenge for me because I didn't know what to say, what to do, and I had to bring my brother with me, take him out of work. And he spoke only a little bit more than I did. And we see the nurses coming in and out, asking a lot of questions. We didn't know what they were asking. We tried to write some papers with like sign, and this, and I was just really confused. And I was just trying to just go with the people, with the group, or with the whatever. I think it was like they use a bunch of medications. Being at home, they know how to read, So like, okay, so I'm gonna take this, or I just figured it out. I just started taking. Probably did it the wrong way. It took more than I did. I don't know. I think that's how I felt, kind of dizzy. And I have a girlfriend in Bloomington, and I didn't have a ride because I didn't know how to drive. So I have to take the bus all the way from north side to northeast, all the way to Bloomington. I got lost many times taking the bus, different routes, and I don't know. It was really, but all those things really helped me to learn. And I remember being in the bus. Many people I was really intimidated by people going in the bus and out the bus. In the bus, really interesting people. And only see those in the movies, being in Mexico, watching the American movies, kind of hardcore, like in the hood movies in the bus. And I was like, I'm really living that kind of like the movies, kind of being there. So it was interesting because people trying to talk to you and people asking for money, and people try, but the interesting thing was that, and still everywhere where I go, people ask me all the time, like, they ask me, are you native? And I say, yes, I am. I'm native of Mexico, But, which we are, we are natives of Mexico. We're part of the Indian Mayas, or many tribes that were back then in Mexico. So in my ex-wife, she was native. She is native. And so that kind of helped me because we kind of blend in with them. And also my brother kind of was funny, but I don't know. You guys, I'm sweating now. Do you guys you can ask me questions? You want me to start?
Talking about the language challenge. It comes in so many strange ways. But I heard of a child was given a prescription, and it said, okay, in English, what does this mean?
Once a day.
Once a day. En español, ¿qué significa?
11, 11.
11. 11 per day. And in this case, it was a fatal dose. Which means 2, which gets very confusing. Anyway, so we talked about going to the hospital and trying to get instructions, and that's why we got so many translators and stuff, but sometimes the translators aren't there when you need them. Okay, let's finish up, Paul.
So I have reports on restaurant. I can't, to be honest, I never asked how to pronounce it. It's Quruxlow Somali restaurant, 1414 East Lake Street. And friend who is a baggage handler at the airport told me to go there, and I actually had a note app on my phone with the food he recommended, the fish with rice and the sambosa. So I ordered that and didn't even use the menu, but definitely the only white person in there is about 1:30, 2 p.m. late lunch last week, and he had recommended it over a year ago, and I just saved the note and never been. So, and he's from Ethiopia, but he said if you want good food, that's where I should go. And it was very friendly, and the wait staff weren't overworked by any means. So I was definitely waited on, and had some delicious tea, and I read some reviews online saying that they're gender divided how you sit, but I didn't get to observe any of that since there was probably only about 14, 15 people in the restaurant at the time. But good Somali dishes, if you like, depending on how much spice you can handle. It's not like a habanero hot. It's like a different type of heat, but it's good. Definitely observe, or you feel some looks. Like I always think of like when the first time I walked into the Riverside Starbucks on 25th and Riverside there, because I just pulled up Starbucks on maps. I didn't look for which one, or I didn't know what it would be like, and it's like a congregation of cab drivers, So, and I walked in there and I was like, oh, and everyone just kind of does the old like. And then I was like, well, I'm from Cambridge and I go to Herman's Bakery, and if someone who's black walks in, that's probably the way they feel. So it's Scandinavian veterans, gray-haired veterans that sit there and do the same thing. So it was definitely humbling. And then I went to the hospital as well and wrote a report on that, but I'll, piggybacking off of Rigo's comment, at work one time, a Hispanic male who was illegal in the U.S. Arrested for DWI because he hit someone else with his car, and didn't want to bring him to jail, so I brought him to detox in Ramsey County, right off of Lafayette. And on the way to jail, his wound, he'd already been examined by medics. He wasn't hurt per se, but he had a slight cut. And so by the time I opened the door, it had reopened, and he had blood down his face. So the nurse at detox didn't like that, and they got all scared and said, well, he needs to be examined by a doctor. So go back in the car, drive back across the seat to Regions. And I was like, well, he's not in custody. He has paperwork. He can show up in court if he wants. I don't know how much he understands. I speak, probably 35% fluent Spanish, so not fluent by any means. And, but he, the Spanish that I had stocked with him, we had built some rapport, and he had kind of learned to trust me, and I kept saying, I'll work with you. And he understood that I wasn't taking him to jail. I was trying to help him out, and so I remember taking the handcuffs off at the Regions Hospital, and he was like an abandoned animal. I mean, he's so scared. It was like, the little rapport that we had, for 2 hours that he had bonded with me. I was like, all right, I'm leaving you here. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he had to stay here, but he was at the hospital. He could be looked at if he wanted to, and I don't know how or where he went from there, but I just remember him sitting down with like the nurse tech in the emergency room, and then she kind of wheeled up the little screen with the Spanish interpreter. But I mean, it's not as personal, but at least he was able to communicate with someone in Spanish. So that's some of the innovations I saw at Regions. I didn't see that at Abbott Northwestern, but I saw that as they had kind of like this little virtual iPad on a stick thing that walked up in front, or that rolled up in front of him, and they were able to have a Spanish interpreter that was probably in some other state or country that was talking to him. But so I just remember that look of kind of like you said, you went to a hospital, with your fairly new to the U.S. in a union, and then you get an injury to your foot, and so that kind of that trauma and unknowing experience, and so that kind of just ping-ponged my brain back to that situation where I'm sure he had a lot of fears going on in his head too. So.
All right. Let's take 3 minutes. If you need coffee or desperately need anything, we'll just get thank you. Todd said, I'm sorry. Sometimes in these moments, how it goes. Yeah.
time period said to come. And we were you know, one other person besides us, two were Caucasian, the rest were all African American. And the bride and groom weren't there yet. And there was one of the groomsmen come up to me and says, "Are you the pastor?" Asked me if I was the pastor. I suppose they're used to it. I mean, a Caucasian guy sometimes being a pastor, maybe, or he was used to it, maybe, I don't know. So he thought maybe I was the pastor. I was wearing a suit coat and everything. He comes up and asks me, "Are you the pastor?" I said, "No, I'm just here as a guest." But they were asking that question. That experience. And then we were at one time another African American church in North Minneapolis where they actually parade down the aisle, where they're clapping and they're going down the aisle and rocking and they're singing a song as they come in, the choir and everything comes in. Yeah, that's an experience too.
Good. I was here for this talk last class, auditing it. You know.
So you like the audit, so you started?
Done with college, but don't want to stop learning, I guess. I'm just considering, or you know Tom, who taught it last year. He's kind of mentoring me in what grad school I should go do, so I'm just trying to keep my options open. Well, because of my work schedule, I'm maybe online. So Grand Canyon, just different options. I wanted to go there for my undergrad, so redemption.
Have you done that like fly out for free thing that they do?
Not yet.
They like fly you out, like you just have to email them and like you send them like an application, like just a simple one, and they like will pay for round trip flying ticket to go for the weekend and just visit the campus. It's like I took it because of free trip to Arizona, but I like fell in love with the campus and like the people and the instructors were so
My
good.
friend Abby went there after high school.
Yeah.
And
Loved it.
when
Yeah, that's where I was looking at.
everything
But
changed,
now I'm going
they
to
actually
Northwestern
took
next year.
us and
Oh, you are?
split us into 12 sections, put us in
Yeah.
rail cars and sent
was that?
the rail cars
My
as
wife's
far
gonna
as
graduate
they
from
could
there in
go.
May, so
Oh, cool. What does she
nation couldn't
graduate
come back
from?
together
Like what
and
program?
School of Education, Spanish Ed.
against the
Cool.
military.
That's awesome.
And then me and
So
my
down
friend
in the
Mike
north
both
end of
graduated
Mexico,
criminal justice majors from there.
You
Okay.
have
Cool.
Mexican
That's awesome.
Americans who are 6 feet tall plus. It's because of the influx.
I was wondering what
of
that big event was at the AIM
Dakota
Center,
blood.
because I work in Burnsville, so I was
Because
driving around, I was like,
Yeah, it was Miss Minnesota pageant.
a lot of bunch of,
The average
a lot
height
of bunch
is
of
6'5",
extra cars
6'7"
this weekend.
for
Yeah,
pure
yeah,
blood.
and then a lot of people left their cars there
And
too, so there was like
there's
a lot of
people,
cars
they
overnight,
don't
and everybody was
even
like,
realize
"Are we
it
gonna get
because we
towed?"
were
And
shipped
they
all
were
over
like
the
all
United States.
panicking
And
about
we
it.
had the tree lighting ceremony
I knew there used to be
on
one in
Friday night
New
or
Mexico.
What
Saturday.
was
There used
it?
to be another side.
Tree lighting
Mexico.
ceremony.
Oh,
There were
oh
the same people
yeah,
because
with all the lights
Carol.
around.
country is split.
Yeah,
Yeah.
They
that
end
was
up
so
both
beautiful.
sides.
On
Yeah, this
Friday
is
night, we
the-
were
we were
walking,
the guys
or
who
like we
fought
were
the
driving
military
to
for
the
the
center
longest,
to check
other
in,
than the Apache.
and like all the lights were like lit up, and it was
So
super
they just-
beautiful
they
around there. And my
literally
grandma was
took
like,
our tribe
"I want to live
and put
here."
them in
It's like
trains into
it was
sets.
really beautiful.
As far as it
Yeah.
goes,
How much is that a huge group? Like if I mentioned someone's name, you would have no idea who they are.
No, it was like, I mean, like running for Miss Minnesota,
Yeah.
or like, no, I would know who they are.
Deonjay?
Yeah,
Yeah, she's my.
actually more
I work out with her boyfriend at LA Fitness.
Okay,
So.
cool. That's awesome. Yeah, no,
I
there
think Marcus
was
was Friday.
there was only like 44 girls, so I met all of them. Yeah,
How'd it go? Good?
it went really well. Yeah, I scored top 5 in 2 categories and then top 10 in one of them. So did pretty good for a first timer, first pageant ever. So yeah, yeah, it was really fun too.
87%.
It was good.
Used to be probably Aztec or one of the one of those, and then a little bit of Spanish, European, other stuff kind of mixed in.
We should take one of those.
Yeah, well, it's just kind of.
That's the way it really should be. Churches, you talk about it, and then you're acting. Yeah. But you're just looking at scripture and society. He's going to eat sermons.
About 5 years ago, this big guy shows up around here, and he's working with the Ethiopian church here. And
Everybody?
about 5 years ago, this big guy shows up around here. We start talking, and we're having many long and cool conversations. And about 100 years ago this year, my dad ran away from home. And then, his mother had died, and he was sent out to live with his Civil War
Casa, Dakota, Todd, Papa Bear, Preacher, Finney, Washicha, Hello, my relatives. My name is Fears No Enemy in Lakota. My name is also Good-Hearted Man in Dakota. My given name is Todd, Papa Bear, Preacher, Finney. I am Oglala, Lakota, and Dakota. Now in that,
Let's have you use the mic so it gets recorded.
oh sure. Now in that, I didn't know I was Native until my mid-20s. It was something that was actually, I was raised in a Scotch-Irish and Irish-Welsh family. That's why I have last name of Finney. I was adopted at birth. Until I was actually at a meeting in in Prince of Peace Church in Burnsville, big Lutheran church in Burnsville, and a woman walks up to me and she goes, "You're Oglala Lakota Sioux." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm Polynesian." She goes, "No, you're Oglala Lakota Sioux." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm Samoan." She goes, "Nope, you're Oglala Lakota Sioux, and I know who your father is." And I just kind of stood there. And she started telling me this story that in the 1970s, a lot of you have seen what's going on at Standing Rock and things like that, Line 3 now in Minnesota, and all that. It's not the first time things like this have happened. In the 1970s, it was a group trying to mine uranium off of Pine Ridge. And so what happened is that there were business Indians, and then there were traditional Indians. I was born of the traditional Indians. What happened is that as they started testing for the uranium, the business Indians started making a lot of money, but the traditional Indians started realizing it was poisoning the water. It was killing people, and so they started protesting. And unfortunately, there was a renegade FBI agent who didn't like that and was into the money and actually handed the business Indians, a group called the Goon Squad, Guardians of the Oglala Nation, M16s. And they started wiping people out on the reservation to the point that it was to a point where people were afraid enough that a group called the Christian Children's Federation, I can't remember that, came in and said, "Okay, here's the deal. We'll adopt your kids out, we'll fudge the paperwork, at least some of you will survive." And it was bad enough that some people said, "Okay, deal." For me, my relatives actually joke that I'm a conflict baby because during this time there was actually a large standoff at a place called Wounded Knee because a man named Leonard Peltier and another group of other people from this, actually some of them from this neighborhood, joined together in a group called AIM, the American Indian Movement. And they said, "Well, here's the deal. We need to bring attention to this in one way or another." And so they went to a place called Wounded Knee where a massacre had taken place before, and they took the church there and had a standoff between the FBI just to bring attention to that. Well, the story is my mom met my dad there. The standoff was in February 1973. I was born November 25th, 1973, 9.5 months after. But because of that, and because of the people that I was related to, they felt it was much safer to have me grow up outside. Because for those of you who don't know, Pine Ridge is a very, very rough area. It took the hurricane in Haiti to actually bring the poverty level of Haiti below Pine Ridge. Before that, Pine Ridge was the poorest area in this hemisphere. So I was actually raised Scotch-Irish household, good Christian faith. My family declined when I was 11 years old to the point where I ended up homeless and on my own at 14 in Minneapolis. Lived at a place called the 410 Homeless Shelter for Women and Children. Took it very hard. Developed my own life where I was outside of pretty much everything. Did pretty well at that. And then in my mid-30s, well, actually early 30s, because it's 2004, so 14 years ago, I got radically convicted that Jesus was real and he loved me. And I've been in a process ever since of working that out, and most recently, in the past 5 years, finding the balance of what that looks like between that life and this life. I run a company called Streets of Hope Outreach, which has been a homeless outreach and ministry for 10 years now in the metro area, just because I know the area, and I have also been involved with AIM and Natives Against Heroin. You're probably talking about a good friend who I call Kola, which would mean brother I'll die for, a guy named James Cross. So it's always a difficult proxy to stand between these, especially because from the church aspect, there were a lot of things done to different people under the name of Jesus. Unfortunately, it was well-meaning, but it was done in fear. It was done in just following orders more than anything else. And for our people, it was really, really difficult for the simple fact that we actually had to dump some of our belief systems to try and escape the onslaught. One of our original belief systems was Wakan Tanka, the God above all gods. In that, the God above all gods looked down on the earth, saw that things weren't going well, and came down as Washi Wakan Tanka, the God above all gods who walks as man, and walked with us and taught us how to be one with the land and taught us how to get along with people and all of that stuff. The elders didn't like it, and they killed him, and he came back as Wanikia, the God who moves as lightning and thunder, who will walk with us and walk us through this life. So when the missionaries first came here, conversion was 100%. Because they're like, well, you know, there's this God up there, cool. And he comes down to earth, okay. And then he dies and he comes back as a ghost. And we call him Jesus. Oh, well, we have other names for him, but cool. All hail Jesus. The problem with that is that greed came in. Just greed. And also things like manifest destiny came into play. And so as things happened, you know, one, how many of you guys know about the War of 1862? The Dakota War? For those of you who don't know, there was actually a war in Minnesota called the Dakota War of 1862. The hard part of that was there was another little skirmish going on called the Civil War. And so that it was kind of overshadowed by what was going on with that. Now in that, in Mankato, on December 26th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln ordered the largest mass execution in American history, where 38 men were hung at once the day after Christmas. Now the real hard part about that is that nobody knows, or at least the stories aren't told, but each one of those men were Christian. In fact, they shook the hangman's hand as they walked up. There were actually over 300 men that were originally sentenced to die, and what happened is the trappers had talked to the military, and they would say, well, you bring the supplies, we'll bring it to those guys for you so you don't have to deal with them, and we'll deal with them. Well, the hard part is the trappers then introduced us to interest. They would actually purposefully hold off the supply trains that we were supposed to get by treaty and then go, well, you need this, and you know, well, we've got this, so we'll do this. We'll give you this amount of grain and this bottle of whiskey, which will keep you really warm. And then when you get your supplies, which were actually sitting at their shops. For the 1 bag of grain and the bottle of whiskey that we get from you, we'll take 3 bags of grain. The hard part is while they were doing this and slowly cutting off the supply, a snowstorm came. And the wagon train that was supposed to get to the reservation stopped. The hard part is that for all of us, to understand where the Dakota people were, 200 miles into Canada, the middle of Kansas, Wyoming, Wisconsin. That was all ours. All of it. Hunted every piece of it, mapped it, charted all the stars. If you ever want to read a really good book, my auntie Gwen Westerman wrote a book called Minnesota Makoche, which means the land of the Dakota people. Minnesota is actually a Dakota word. Minnetonka is Minne means water. Soda actually means cloudy water, or magical water, or smoking, misting water. The oldest story about Minnesota, and understand I have ADD, so we'll come back, and if we don't, just ask a good question. The story is that how Minnesota got its name was before all of this tragedy happened. There were actually groups that came out as scouts, and there were skirmishes that went on. Well, one of the chiefs went out at night, and another chief dressed in white from head to toe met him. Said, there are men coming from the east, and they're going to kill everyone. So pack your people up and go. Said, okay. Went to his people, packed it up. They started heading west. Well, they get to the Minnesota River. They hear tales of what's going on with some of these scouting parties. And so they say, well, the elders are going to sit down by the river and pray. The women and children will hide in the reeds with them. And then the men will go charging back and try and hold off the army as long as possible until we find a way across. On the morning of the 3rd day, they woke up and the water was smoking. They could see that there was smoke rising off the water. And all of a sudden they saw a path. And they crossed across the river on the path, and they went up to what's now called Sioux Valley. And Sioux Valley is actually the only reserve/reservation that has never had any contact with the military in a negative fashion, because they went to a place that was so remote that nobody really knew they were there. It's actually really interesting, because if you go to the wall, you can really kind of feel the spirit of what a reservation feels like. But if you go to Sioux Valley, it's this strange, free place where everyone just, I can't even explain it. It's brilliant. But that's how Minnesota got its name. After that, everybody said it was the land of the magical smoking water. They'll tell you it's cloudy water, but magical smoking. So, wagon train is on its way, gets stuck in the snow. People are starving. They're actually saying that at this time, women, when the military would roll through, that when their horses left what was left behind, that it was bad enough that the women would go pick through that for the grain that was left. And that's what they would make their soup with. And people got hungry enough that some of the guys said, hey, there's a farm over there where I know there's eggs. So they went, and the farmer caught them. And a fight ensued, and they killed the entire family. And that's really what sparked the war. It was an act of desperation and misunderstanding. Now in that, until the military got heavily involved, there was actually really good relations between everybody. In fact, when the Dakota War first broke out, there's a family in South called the Wagners, and they own Wagner Farms, Inspired Acres, all of that. And when the war broke out, some of my relatives came charging out of the woods, and they had already established a relationship with my good friend Dave's great-great-grandfather. And they looked at him and said, get down, get down, get down. And he hit the dirt, and a war party came charging out of the woods. And they chased him out and said, oh, no, he went that way, he went that way. And then he turned around, he's like, get your family, get out of here, things are bad. And so, war broke out. There were a lot of reluctant leaders during that, guys named Little Crow, and various other people. And at the end of 1862, they had gotten to a point where they cut off supply lines, people were starving, and the military rounded up 303. Well, they'll state 303, other people will say it's 360, nobody will ever really truly know. And they brought them in and said, we're going to kill all of these men. And they said, nope, we're going to send this to Lincoln. And there's actually a Lutheran bishop, a guy named Bishop Whipple, who was out of Faribault, Minnesota, who went back and forth to Washington, D.C. to plead for clemency directly to Abraham Lincoln. In fact, if you ever go to Dakota honoring things, his great-great-grandson usually shows up, and we receive him as one of our own. Didn't work. Lincoln sentenced 38 men to death by hanging on December 26, 1862. A lot of people will say, well, he gave clemency to the other guys. Yeah, the problem is all of those guys were either starved to death, beaten to death, or frozen to death. None of the men who were arrested at that point survived. So only 38 men were hung, but the rest probably had a much worse exit to this world than anyone else. The hardest part for that is that much of it was done in the name of Jesus, even though they didn't understand that many of the men were Christian. In fact, one of my son's namesake, who would be my great-great-great-grandfather, as they were about to be hung, spoke up and said, listen now, my people, said we go to meet our Maker. So don't look at this as a tragedy. Look at this as a victory as we venture into the great unknown. And then he proceeded to start singing a worship song, a Christian worship song in Dakota. And all of the men started singing it, and they were hung in the middle of the song. There's actually a really old story that says someday that there will be 38 of us who are all descendants of those men, and we'll finish that song, and peace will come to the land. So, with that, so some of this stuff is. This is actually, we have names and titles for a lot of different stuff. And we don't, it's considered disrespect to speak the name of an elder who's passed on. Because in traditional belief system, he's in heaven, he's having a great time. Why does he want to come back? And if we call him, either he'll come back or something looking for his descendants will come back. It is what it is. One of our main things is what most of you guys have seen and what most of you guys identify Indians as is a big drum. The cool part is the big drum is Dakota. We are the originators of the big drum. We actually were the first ones, and as we created treaties between each person in each country, because we looked at the Anishinaabe as a separate country. Ojibwe. We call them Anishinaabe, separate country. As we would get our treaties with them, we would present them with that because it was our greatest gift. In fact, most of you guys have heard of Red Lake. There was actually a battle there, and that's how it got called Red Lake, because the bodies were left on the lake. And when it was a wintertime battle, and when the snow thawed, the entire lake became red. Now in that, we decided that neither side really wanted to ever do that again. And so a treaty was made, and that was actually the first time the big drum was gifted. A lot of the stories that you'll hear about us fighting amongst each other, yes, there were skirmishes, but not on the scale that was given. We had diplomatic ties to pretty much everybody. Now, there were small outlying groups like, well, Crow, the Pawnee, Little, mostly the guys that are featured in you'll see them in the movies, usually the guys with the mohawks and a bunch of red face paint and really angry looking. And it was just, everybody's got their bad bunch. But for the most part, most of us had trade routes, and so that's why you'll see this drum coast to coast. Another thing that you would see is that when women get married in a Dakota nation, you'll see shells that come across their breastplate. Now, the funny thing about that is the shells actually go from east coast to west coast. And what it was a display of how well your family got along with everybody all across Turtle Island. Because that was it. You traded with everyone from one side to the other. We're actually, we've taken the word kola and said brother that will die for you, but the real originality of brother that will die for you is the word Dakota. That's why we're known as the brother nation. You ask anybody else, all the other tribes, we're known as the brother nation. But we were also very fierce warriors, incredibly fierce warriors. In fact, with my brother over here, he's probably more Native American than he knows. For the simple fact that when they actually, in the 1860s, they actually, one part was that it became illegal to be off the reservation if you were a Dakota male in the state of Minnesota. And if you were off the reservation from December 26, 1862 to December 26, 2012, you were considered hostile and you could legally be killed. But also during that time, one of the things they did is they split up all the warriors, people that were considered warriors, and they put them on train cars. And they sent the train cars as far as they would go, north, south, east, west. And wherever the rail stopped, that's where they dropped them off. It was said that we were split up 12 times, and we were sent to everywhere. That's why, and it was simply so we could never amass again. We could never come together again. The funny part is that now, on all corners of the United States, you suddenly have Native Americans, because you're from the continent of America, of North America, so regardless, you're a Native American. South American, continent of South America, Native American. Once you hit 6 foot, odds are is that there's probably Dakota blood in you. We were actually called the Oyate. Everybody says we're the originals. That however we got here, we were the first. And for Dakota, I'm short. Average height is 6'3", 6'5". And so you suddenly saw this influx of Seminoles, Mexican Americans, even as far down as Guatemala, that are all of a sudden 6 feet tall. And they actually say that that was the result of them splitting us up. The funniest part is they said they would never, ever, ever get back together again. And last year at Standing Rock, or 2 years ago now, actually everybody came back together again. And we also formed what's called the Horn, which was one of the, depending on which side of it, was either the most brilliant military exercise or the most terrifying. The last time it got assembled, a guy named George Armstrong Custer had a really bad day. And what it is it's the Oglala sit at one end, and then the Midwankton sit at the other end, and all of the tribes come in, and it comes down like this and comes up around. And then what happens is the Midwankton fight them into the center, and then the Oglala and Midwankton meet, and the Sisseton, Yankton, everybody just comes together. And works out pretty good. At Standing Rock, that order got sent out to reassemble. And so right now we're setting into this whole new realm of trying to figure out society, but so much of our society has been erased and so much of our society has been adopted or been homogenized or been changed that it is becoming a very problematic situation for us. We had from the 1860s on, we had what were called boarding schools. What happened is you went in there and you said, my name is Dawansa Mazakaga. What does that mean? Well, Dawansa means the one who sings. No, that sounds, how about John? How about John? John's a good name. Well, Mazakaga, what does Mazakaga mean? Works with iron. Oh, blacksmith. John Blacksmith. How about that, John? And the hard part is that if you dared go against any of it, the results would be very bad. One of my great-grandfathers tells me a story that still haunts him, or haunted him until he passed, about remembering that one of his friends, when they were 7 years old, looked at him and called him by his given name, by his native name. And they took that 7-year-old boy out to the shed and he never came back for just speaking a name. The really hard part is that the Catholics and Lutherans were involved because they were the ones running the schools. Or Episcopals, yeah. Episcopals, yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think it's a Sid standing here, but fair enough. But yeah, remember me talking about manifest destiny. What happened is the military came in, said, okay, we've pacified them, and we've got to go west. So here, buddy, Reverend, here's your rifle, pacify them. Have a good one. They had taught them how to perform martial law and pretty much nothing else. And so you had these guys who, as far as they were concerned, were outnumbered, surrounded by savages, and had to figure out a way to pacify them, to make them. And you had governmental mandates that literally, and if you look it up, and I can't quote, I think it's 1865, where there's a paper released about the boarding schools, and it simply said, if you kill the Indian, you can save the man. So they would cut their hair, change their names, beat them if they spoke any languages, and then tell them it was in the name of Jesus. To the point where most of my relatives who are traditional actually still speak about anybody from a church as a black robe, because that's what the missionaries wore, was black robes. The funniest part is that when we made our turn, it was because of all that. You remember me talking about having Wakan Tanka, Washi Wakan Tanka. We actually dumped all of that because we felt like if we gave up everything that had to do with anything European, maybe they'd leave us alone. And the story I was told was, this guy named, Charlie lives down by the river. He prays to the wolf. Really? Do they bother him? No. All hail Wolf God. That our turn to paganism was actually a result of what was going on. But the cool part of that is that right now there is a huge thing going on where there were a lot of prophecies that we had over our people and over seventh generations, and that it just talks about remembering our ways and teaching them to you guys, and peace coming from it. The hard part about that is there's so many cultural differences and hurts that it's a very difficult point to do. There's so many different structures and systems. Like, just as an example, I ride in a ride called the Dakota 38 plus 2 Wokiksuya ride. We ride from Crow Creek in South Dakota to Mankato. We leave on December 10th. We arrive in Mankato on December 26th. What it's called is a Wokiksuye ride. And what Wokiksuye ride means is a prayer ride of forgiving everyone everything. And what it is it's an intentional return to the spot of the hanging, and from Crow Creek back to the hanging, we pray for everything that's happened between then in our return home. Now, Crow Creek is simply because what happened is in 1862, after the hangings, they put everybody in boats. They went down the Minnesota River, up the Missouri River, and some people will say it was planned, but some people say it just, one of the boats broke down. And so they ran the other boats ashore and said, this looks good, and dropped everybody off there. The hard part is that since those moments, how many of you have ever been to a reservation other than Mystic? How many of you have ever been to like a South Dakota reservation other than this? Other than Flanders, you're going to a third world nation. There was actually the reservation in Jackson, Wyoming is actually, if you look at the reservation in Jackson and Auschwitz, it's actually matches for layout. Because Adolf Hitler studied how the United States treated the natives and thought it was brilliant on how they could destroy an entire culture of people. The death camps were actually modeled after the American reservations. The hard part for that is that you're in the armpit of the universe. You're stuck somewhere between present and past. Yeah, I'm a full-grown man that walks around with a Minnesota wolf on his head. Now, the cool part about that one is there's only two of them. The Anishinaabe have one and Dakota have one, and they're called the messengers. And what it is it's given to people who they believe are going to bring knowledge. And so, cool part for me is, as long as I have this part on me, I don't have to wear that thing all the time. So, because if you notice, this actually matches the other eagle feathers. But we have this culture, and the funniest part is as I explained to my wife, I have this amazingly awesome, intercessing, IT working wife. And I'm chasing butterflies and playing music and living out of this culture. And so for her, it's the process. And for me, it's, it'll happen. We live in a strict honor system. She lives in a questions and answers system. What do I mean by that? I was on the ride, and we had a couple of days off. And I was like, we're close enough to home. We're at Morton. In 2 hours, I can be sleeping in my bed. I'm going to go home and just sleep for the night. Packed just an overnight bag. Started walking out the door. One of my elders looked at me and says, where are you going? I said, I'm going to run home to sleep for the night. He goes, no, you're not. I said, okay. Called my wife. She goes, so you coming home? I said, nope. I said, well, why? I said, elder says I can't. Did you ask him why? I said, that's not my job to ask, honey. And the hard part for her to process is she wanted to answer that question. And for me, in our honor system, I knew, let's just say if you ask an elder a question, you better plan for like the long book answer. I remember seeing one time where one of my friends asked a drum keeper a question, and we stood outside in negative 20 degrees having to face him as he explained to our friend, because we were responsible for our friend, why it wasn't proper to ask him that. And we stood there for almost, for me it seemed like 3 days, but probably like 15, 20 minutes. It was negative 20 with a negative 30 wind chill. And all we could do is stand there like this. And then we got back in the car and looked at Inkpa and started yelling at him. But we live in a very strict honor system. Now, the funny part is the honor is a deserved honor system. Like right before we left from the end of the ride, which was 3 days later, my elder walked over to me and says, just so you know, the reason I didn't want you to go is that you know all those people come in on Morton. I said, yeah. He says, well, since you've been on this ride, there's always peace. And I was afraid if you left, you'd take that peace with you. It's like, oh, cool. And so at the dinner, I was able to sit down with my wife and tell her exactly what went on. And she still thought that I should have asked the question right away, and I said, you know, it's still not my place. The other thing that we don't do is when you're being confronted by an elder, you don't look them in the eyes. Or if you're having a serious conversation with another man, you don't look them in the eyes, because that is looked at as a challenge. That is, I would like to fight you right now. That's why if you're ever dealing with natives, especially in large groups of natives, you'll watch us talk to each other like this and just walk and talk, looking down at the ground. Another difference for Dakota Nation, men and women have two separate languages. Now we share certain words, but for the most part we have two separate languages. Like for me, and you'll understand how prolific Dakota language is in most things. One, we're the only guys with headdresses, or bonnets is what we call them. Two, originator of the big drums. Three, how we say hello to each other, how. That's real. That's hello. Or like us, we'll usually go ho ho, which is just kind of like right on. Now women will say han. You'll also hear things like Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, which have been scientifically classified as three separate groups. When really, for the most part, it was just dialect differences. Like for me, if I'm speaking to my Lekshi Jim, my Uncle Jim, who's in the West End, he's my Lekshi. Like L. If I'm speaking to my Uncle Jimmy in Nebraska, he's my Dekshi. If I'm speaking to, actually my Uncle Carl, who's Carl, in Canada, he's my Nekshi. It's just the way that we pronounce words. And in fact, we'll joke back and forth on, we'll add the L's and D's to other things. Like one of my cousins will always tell me that he's craving enchiladas. Things like that. But it's really just a dialect difference. But the fun part is that women can actually use both languages. But if she speaks to you as a man, be careful, because that means she will fight you as a man too. But men do not use the women's language, because that's the nurturer's language and we're warriors. One of the things people will say, things that have been brought up, why don't women hit drums? Okay, now at New Day, my daughters hit my drum, big deal. But in traditional sense, if you go to a powwow, there will be no women drummers. Now, people will be like, it's misogynistic, it's this, it's that. The reality is that the drum, you are striking it. You're hitting it. You're committing a violent act. Women aren't supposed to hit stuff. It's the man's job. They're the nurturers. They're the caretakers. We take care of the business. They do all the good stuff. And in that, we're a matriarchal society. Most Native American societies are. We do have chiefs. Each one of the chiefs, or recognized chiefs, will have a bonnet. But the truth of the matter is that when really big problems would arise, all of the chiefs would get together and they would sit down in a room and they would sit there and they would start speaking and they would just have a discussion and talk about all of it. And what history books won't tell you is that there would be 4 women behind them. Usually the 4 women who represented the main chiefs, the chief of chiefs for each group, also representing north, south, east, and west for quadrants of the areas that they were in. The men would get done discussing, the men would leave. The women would sit down, they would pray, and then they would go tell the men what was going to happen. And then the men would come out and say things. But because that was never seen, everybody just presumed, oh, these are, the reality is, in all honesty, if my auntie tells me to do something and my uncle tells me to do something different, I'm doing whatever auntie says. It's just that way. There were a lot of mistaken things that were put there to villainize us and to create this different thing, this different view. It's kind of like how the llama got llama. For those of you who don't know, Spaniards walked up to him and went, "¿Cómo te llama?" And the guys down in Peru went, "Llama? Oh, it must be a llama. It must be a llama." That's how llamas got named. Same thing happened up here. Like Sioux. Everybody hears Sioux, and we'll say it, and we're trying to get away from it. We actually say Yoyate, because what happened is that when the Anishinaabe translators came along, they said, beyond that the river that winds like a snake is a different people, beyond the Mississippi River. Well, they translated it into beyond that river, there's the snake people. And that's how we got that inflection of Sioux in there, is we were the snake people. And no matter what culture you're in, snake is not a favorable animal. So the fun fact of that is that you'll see our culture in everything. You ever want to have a really fun time, go to the Smithsonian Native American Museum, and you can actually walk through their rooms and you can see how much we have proliferated all of American culture, even if it was done wrong. Some of you guys may not know this because you're just age bracket, but how many have seen Dances with Wolves? Okay, for us, it's one of the funniest movies we've ever seen in our lives. For the simple fact, the woman who was translating the script never gave context. So when that guy at the end yells out, "Dances with Wolves, I love you," it's a wife talking to her husband. Most of the scenes where the men are talking, they're speaking as women. So it's a great try, but you have to remember that even in the days of Costner, there's still misunderstandings going on. With the wall, it's 80% Anishinaabe. And Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. You'll say Anishinaabe, Chippewa, all that. It's kind of like us saying Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, or like Oglala, Sissetonah, Yanktonai. It's, and what you're seeing is the cultural result of an identity being stolen and the vacuum that's left and people filling it with whatever they can. And then being displaced. And the hard part is that so much identity is stolen and so many wrongs. If you want to see some really weird facts, just look up missing and murdered Indigenous women. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. The highest murder rate in the United States is Indigenous women for any societal structure. You see, at one point, Pine Ridge was 90 or 92% alcoholism. Our average life expectancy, I think Pine Ridge is 65. Or no, I'm sorry, that's Alaska. We're 48. So it's just a weird road to walk, and there are so many cultural differences because we just do things differently. The system of honor is always something that messes with my wife, and I try and teach her. But the thing is that in an industrialized culture, it's very difficult to convey it without seeming patronizing. Like, when we go on the ride, my son will be exposed to an honor system that he hasn't, well, to a certain extent. But where people are honored for doing some of the most simple things, but doing it in a non-patronizing way because that's just the culture. Like taking young ones beside and telling them, picking up them cigarette butts, that was a great thing. You're cleaning up the earth. Uchimakai is happy with you, Mother Earth. But in that, it's also really hard for us to transition in some things, even this way, because like my wife does it all the time. She goes, "Why did you let him do that?" I said, "Well, he told me he was going to do this." "But he didn't." I said, "Well, he said he was gonna." "But you can't trust people like that." I said, "Honey, we're an oral society. I get it. But it's not my job to regulate him in that way. If he says it, I hold him to his word until he lets me down." And unfortunately, for us, in the past, that didn't really work out real well. We ended up with some really cool beads and a lot of whiskey. But yeah, there's so much to tell you and so much to try and fill in an hour that I'm just kind of grabbing from here and grabbing from there. The other thing is in many societies, we actually, one of my favorite aspects of us is adoption is a word. As a patriarch or matriarch, if you announce that someone is your brother, your sister, your cousin, your mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, it's done. There is no discussing it. It is done. It is finished. And the other person is entitled to, or it's required to serve them in the way that you would as such. And the really cool part of that is that one of the ways that we bridge the gap is being relational. I have two brothers that are about this tall. One of them is bald. Well, actually, both of them are bald. One of them is covered with tattoos. Both of them originally had blonde hair and blue eyes, and everybody recognizes them as my brothers. Now, the hard part of that for a Eurocentric culture is infusing honor on that. Because if they dishonor me, then they're in trouble, and I'm in trouble, and then I have to discipline them. So when somebody calls them that, it's an important thing. It's a regalness, especially with different bloodlines. You're instantly infused into that. But the thought is, for you guys, and we'll open it up for questions. What happens if you develop a relationship with somebody where they invite you in as a family member? Because really that's what it's going to take for the church to become a bridge to all Native Americans. Like somebody along the way said, "Who is my brother? Who is my sister? If they're for me, they are my brother, they are my sister." It's in a culture of honor, that's the most important thing. It's developing those relationships. Even to, like for us, we'll say Koda, Kola. Koda, my brother. Kola, brother who I will die for. And to make that switch from Koda to Kola is a huge honor. Let alone, then beyond there, there's Sinye and Misu, older brother, younger brother. So first, you're the brother. Then you're the brother to die for. Then you're Sinye, my blood. Misu, my blood, whether older or younger. But it's all relational. You can't get it by handing out a t-shirt, and that could be a great start, but it has to be, has to be melded with honor. It has to be melded with genuine heart. And it's a relational thing, and the hardest part for us at this point is most of the stuff that we're trying to get over is still happening. There's currently people up fighting on line 3 to try and stop the water from poisoning the land. Now, for Standing Rock, understand that Standing Rock is about the same distance as Bismarck was from where they wanted to run the oil line there. EPA said, nope, way too dangerous to put the oil there. Well, let's move over to Standing Rock. And the other part of that is that the big hill that you saw all of the soldiers standing on, that's actually a giant burial mound of all of our greatest warriors. So to understand the concept, think if I took a D5 dozer and just started running right down the white stones right over by the airport, and how many people would not be happy with me. I dare say that there would be a little uproar if I started plowing through those areas. And so, not that I have answers for it. I think there's safe ways to convey all kinds of energies, but just to try and explain our position on one side of it. I think if it can be dealt with safely and the EPA can check off on it, cool. But if it has a chance to eliminate another reservation or poison them like it has before, it is what it is. Oh, and this stuff. This actually is, most people know me as Papa Bear or Papa Bear Preach. But this is a medicine wheel, and this is specifically Lakota, this color strand. And what it actually means, the 4 colors, north, south, east, and west, but it's also body, mind, spirit, and soul. And that your body, mind, and soul must align with the spirit, Wanikia, Spirit of God. So, I still want to give Roland time, so, yeah. Makoche, M-A-C-O-C-E. C-E. And Minnesota is M-N-I-S-O-T-A. Minnesota. So M-N-I-S-O-T-A. And then it's Gwen, G-W-E-N, Westerman is the author. So she's actually a professor down at Mankato. Yeah.
And so I was super involved, and we had lots of young men and women at our house, and a lot of ones that used to call me their sister.
Yeah.
Still to this day, I've seen some of them, and they still call me their sister.
Yeah, it's permanent.
Yeah,
So.
super cool. But I know that there was a lot of rivalry between men, specifically, and my dad had to break up some fights because of it. And so, but it was usually between the different tribes.
Like Crow and Dakota and Anishinaabe. We're working through it. Like on the Dakota 38 ride, there's tribes from all over. The hard part that you have to realize is that we kind of got pitted against each other from the get-go, because as people moved west, they would just go, oh, okay, like for the Anishinaabe. Okay, we want Wisconsin, your land is over there now. And we were just kind of sitting there like, no, it's not. It was that manifest destiny. Everybody got squeezed. And so all of a sudden, all of these people who had been peaceful for years and years and years, well, look at Phillips. When you mash a bunch of cultures together that, were never walked into how to work with each other. Originally everybody just kind of wandered, had their own guidelines and all that. So we're still working through it. I'd like to say it's a great thing, but I still have a relative who's half Crow, and the Crow and the Dakota were notorious kind of squabblers, and every now and then one of my other cousins will go when the other one walks by. So, it's getting better, but there's still just, we can't figure out ourselves. So it's kind of, but now we're moving to a point where everybody's starting to find their identity again. That's why you're seeing the proliferation of all this stuff. So, do you have a? Okay. Oh, and for this stuff, big drum, right there. This is actually a hand drum. It was made by a bunch of guys that were actually at Wounded Knee. This is my son's hand drum. Then this is actually the cool part about that. This is a crow. You'll see actually different designs for each different tribe. This is actually crow for this beadwork, specifically crow. And then, let's see if I can get the right pocket off the get-go. Yep. And then this is one from Standing Rock. This is actually a really old one. So, and you can see it's the colors of Standing Rock. So, and then all the daisies and stuff, because as one of my cousins would say, "Honk Papa, the first to fight and the last to leave, but we don't like to fight." So, a guy named John Eagle Sr., who probably a lot of you guys saw in the, if you watch the news stuff. This is actually an Anishinaabe turtle rattle, made with a turtle and a stick and some beads. And then this is a Mohawk gourd rattle with jingle bells. This was actually given to me at a Dakota honoring in 2017 by a guy named Jonathan Miracle, who has a really awesome Mohawk worship band called Broken Walls. So, and the cool part about that is on the ride, one of the songs that we sing is actually the oldest worship song on the continent. And the way the elder taught me, who wasn't a believer, but said, this is the oldest worship song on the continent, and we sing it to your God, and we were singing it when your Jesus was alive. So, but we were singing that at the grave of one of the recognized leaders of the Indian side of the Dakota War, and it was a cloudy day, and all of a sudden we started watching as like this finger started drawing lines across the sky. And then you couldn't see the finger, but just these lines. And then all of a sudden, vertical lines. And it started looking like a brick wall. And then one by one, the bricks started exploding until we had this beautiful, beautiful sunrise. And one of our elders stood up and said, "Today, I declare a day of broken walls." And I was trying hard not to ugly cry, because it was, Jonathan actually prophesied that. That's why he named the band. Like almost 20 or 30 years ago now. He said that God was going to break down the walls between the people. So. Yep. Yep. Yep.
And Wakan came into something you were talking. That was my dad's, the name my dad was given when he was adopted, Maza Wakan. He used to hunt for the old chief.
Right.
And he called him Shotgun, but they didn't have a word
Yeah,
for shotgun.
Maza Wakan.
So the Dakota term for gun or shotgun is Maza, iron, Wakan, holy iron.
Yep.
Like a Shunka is a dog.
Yep.
But they didn't have a word. They had never seen a horse before, so they named a horse Shunka Wakan, which means holy horse.
Yep.
And you said Minnewash Day. What does that mean? Did you say that?
Minnewash Day?
Yeah.
Minnewash Day is good water.
Good. Okay.
Minnewash Day.
Okay. Anyway.
Usually referred to as like holy water.
Good. Father, we ask that we thank you for Papa Bear. We thank you for his work. We thank you for his presentation tonight. And Father God, we have hundreds of years of ill will that only you can break through, and we ask you to use us as humble servants. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, let's take a few minutes here, and then I'm going to... Okay. All right. Take your 5 minutes. I'm going to run upstairs and grab something.
Is there a church where native that is a native church?
Like Christian native, or yes, there are becoming some. So the hard bridges that you have, a lot of times you have like the natives who were kind of indoctrinated, and then you have traditional believers. So it's really a clash of, like, if you go to the res, there's actually two governments there. You have the spiritual government, and then you have the tribal government. And often the tribal government will be Christian, the spiritual government will be traditional. And unfortunately, tribal government will play a lot of favoritism. And so it's a hard proxy. So, but it's finding the dualities in it, and also, like, there's a word named Tunkashela, and it's, you talk to the business Indians, and they'll be like, you can't say that, blah, 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 it's grandfather, it's all of this. Well, when I was writing, one of my older brothers, who is one of the heads of the NAC Native American Churches, a traditional church, asked me to start singing, and I was like, I can't sing that, and the Holy Spirit, wherever you guys land on this, Holy Spirit said it's okay to sing it. So I started singing it with him, and as I'm singing it, Holy Spirit goes, it doesn't mean grandfather, it means the father of all fathers. And so I started because it was just the presence of God in it. I said, Wilford, what does Tunkashela mean? He goes, oh yeah, Washichu's got that around it means steal the fat. That's what Washichu means. But it's the term that we use for Europeans. So they got it wrong, it means father of all fathers. And then I just said, but you'll have people who will pray like that, and then you'll have other natives in the church be like, you can't say that word, you can't. Like for the drums, they really, there are some people, if I try and bring a drum in a church, they'll freak out. Like they'll completely freak out because they associate it with other things. And sure, there are songs that, it's kind of like a guitar. You can play praise music or you can play not praise music, as a drum. The actual story of the drum is that it's the heartbeat of the individual who owns it. So like on this one, that one's actually Wakansikakua, which means the devil hunter or the demon hunter. And so what it said is that when we play it, the angels come to hunt the demons. So, which is really fun because my buddy, there's a hardcore Christian band called Demon Hunter, and my buddy sent me a couple of stickers. And so I put one on there, superimposed it, and then covered it with black so it would just sit there. So, and tobacco is money. It was the most expensive thing ever. So when people are giving tobacco back and forth or cigarettes or things like that, it's just because at one point it was our gold. Because we had gold everywhere. We didn't care about that. It was, it was the tobacco that was the treasure and stuff.
Do you know a Mrs. Beaver in a house church?
Hmm?
Do you know a lady named Mrs. Beaver?
Yeah. I play worship at the house.
I was gonna go with that Jesus in the City Church.
Okay. I'll be there Saturday the 1st playing worship.
Really?
I played worship all over the nation. So like I just got back from DC for a thing called All Tribes GC where we went out and played worship out there. It was pretty fun. So yeah, house church is a great place. Jamie is a very dear friend to me. So I've been there I'm at one of the church plants from there now.
Oh, really?
But it's in Belplain. So yeah, I've been there about 8 years now.
This might be a big question, but even in terms of you coming to faith, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning. Is there could you tell us a little more about that?
It's a really long story, but my ex actually met Jesus in an ice house while she was trying to commit suicide in our Yukon Denali. Came back. Jesus told her a bunch of different things that were going to happen over the next 6 months. We laughed it off, told her to go to bed, that she had just been partying too hard or whatever. And over the next 6 months, it started happening. So, and for this stuff, we've had some really cool miracles, signs, and wonders happen, so that nobody really bothers me about my faith and being able. So, especially like my older brother's the head of the IAC, so he's basically kind of like the pagan pope of North America. And he actually has me pray over him and stuff like that. So a lot of it's just walking out faith and letting God show up and using it as a teaching point. Because I'll just mess it up.
In the same way the honor system is upheld, does that kind of benefit you in your faith in the way that they see the acts proceed?
and that's the interesting part about like people trying to come into Native culture and be like, you gotta do, like we've been doing your system for 4,000 years, you know, what you're talking about, the hierarchy where we just have faith and we understand, we do that within our culture, we do that within our people. You know, and then trying to teach it to somebody who already understands it, it's kind of, you know, it's like sitting down with a Catholic nun trying to teach you basic mathematics. Yelling at you, 2 + 2 is 4. Yeah, I get it. You know. So, you know, after a while, you get a little annoyed with it. So yeah, no, it's you know, it's the honor system's the honor system. It's a running joke because a lot of times, like with our young kids, you know, to teach them, we'll put them in purposefully embarrassing situations. But then when they get done with it, you know, they'll be like very highly like, you did awesome. You know, like one of our standing chiefs was having a speech, and my son was sitting next to me, and my auntie looks at me and goes, "I'm thirsty," and I look at my son and he goes, and he walks around and the only place a bottle of water was right up behind our standing chief. So he walks up on stage, grabs a bottle of water, the standing chief just stops and turns around at him, and he comes down the stage and puts it in front of Auntie, and then he literally like prayed, "Oh, this is amazing, this young man has done this, we thank you for doing everything." You know, where if like, if you're like in any large denominational church, and all of a sudden a kid walks up and is like, "I need this from up here," and walks off the stage. You know, so you know, it's putting people out there, but like, then all of a sudden my son was like, "Oh, this is awesome." Everybody's like congratulating me on what a great job I did for grabbing Auntie a drink of water. And then if you follow, I think you guys probably saw my face, like the next year he had like water bottles like all lined up in his coat. He's like, "I'm ready." It's like so yeah, it is what it is.
I suspect this is way too much of a story, but you had mentioned growing up, living one culture, thinking yourself a different, and now realizing, so just the whole, what I'm wondering is, you know, how did you develop your identity?
A lot of elders.
You know?
When everybody figured out who I was, I got fast-tracked into sitting down in front of people and literally having elders tell me story after story after story after story after story after story. And the cool part is we're oral people, so they tell it like, I would go in there and be like, "Great, I gotta sit here for an hour," and all of a sudden it'd be dark, and I'd be like, "That was amazing," you know. So men like Willard Mailbear, Wilford Keeble, a bunch of the story keepers, and so they walked me through it. And the thing was finding other people just like me, where they're like, "Oh yeah, this is another one of the kids," you know. But then also being, I've reconciled my adopted family. We've all reconciled. We're all really tight. It was just a hard time in life, and so I've always been able to keep duality. You know. So it's been a system. My wife jokes that I'm a native Moses. So.
What was the
It was an AA.
I'm just curious because I sat in that parking lot for hours and my FTO quizzed me about it.
Yep.
So I'm in the park right now, lot. He's saying, "All right, what do you do if this happens?" So that parking lot's like has a whole other meaning to me.
Yep.
It's a big place now.
Oh yeah. Yep. No, I was AA. Getting my head right. The rest of me.
There we go. Okay. All right, let's get started. We've got a lot of miles to go before we're done with this whole statement. Okay. Todd, beautiful job. Thank you. I would like to talk about what Todd just said, but we don't have time to do that tonight. After the Dakota Uprising or the Dakota War of 1862, not only were those guys hauled off for a trial, a kangaroo trial in Iowa, where they sometimes were judged in less than a minute. Then the families, the women, children, old guys, were marched from the reservations, the upper and lower agencies along the Minnesota River. They were marched up the Minnesota River and to Fort Snelling. And at every town along the way, people poured boiling water on them, spit on them, hit them with rocks. A lot of Indian people were hurt very badly. Then there was a concentration camp created in the winter of 1862 and 3 at Fort Snelling, and particularly Hitler made mention of that in his writings as a justification for the way that the concentration camps that he created. Very nice, huh? And almost every night, as I understand it, at Fort Snelling, a different young woman, a native woman, would be found raped and her throat slit, and all throughout that winter. I wish this worked. I don't know why this doesn't work. I'm going to try it one more time. Oh, it works. What happened? All of a sudden it works. It hasn't worked all fall. Hallelujah. All right. Well, good. All right. So, if you look at a circus tent, I've never seen one myself, but I've seen them in movies. They've got some big poles that hold everything up, and there's one central pole in the middle. And this Entrepreneuring the Church piece that we're going to touch on next is the central pole of what we're trying to do. The purpose of this class is teaching Christians to build and lead cross-cultural ministries. So to build and lead is what we're talking about. Cross-cultural is what we're working on. It's for Christians, but we're here to teach you to build and lead. Now, to teach you to entrepreneur would be a critical piece here, and I don't know. I'm not aware of another class that teaches people how to entrepreneur. It's interesting. On public radio, they got rid of one of the shows that has run for many years and has gone through various morphings, and their new 10 o'clock on Saturday morning show is about We Built It or something like that, and it's all about entrepreneurs. It's all about people that have built stuff. Somebody can go out with him. Oh, okay, good. All right, so what we want to talk about here is to gain a sense of what does God want to do? Now, what's interesting is Paul went on all of his various trips. Now, you have a fill-in-the-blank version of this in front of you. I just want to stop and say, the basic outline is in front of you. Now, I will be telling stories to fill in and illustrate. Now, with hundreds of people having come through this class over 24 years, I've only had one student, but it really threw me. A couple of years ago, one of our students was taking it for college credit, really just flamed me on this course. And he said, well, he didn't stay with the outline, and he just went off telling all these stories. Every story I tell you is for a purpose. I'm not wandering off into something. I will be illustrating all the different aspects of this with many stories. They're not on here. So when I tell a story, if you want to remember it, write it down. Make an outline of what I'm saying, okay? I didn't put all the stories on here because there isn't room. So you can go through and fill in. If you get to a point where there's a blank and I haven't explained it or you don't see it up here behind me, then holler, okay? And I will help to make it manifestly clear. What? Save your neck, like last one. Yeah, well, thank you. So Paul, every place he went, it's interesting, he didn't use the Paul method. He didn't have the Paul method, like the Kennedy evangelism explosion, or just walk across the room, or the four spiritual laws, sorry, or any one method. There wasn't the Paul method. Every time he went someplace, he went there and he looked for God's opening. And every time and every place he went, it was different. He looked to see where God had prepared an opening, and he watched for that, and every time he did the minute, sometimes he went to the Jewish people first, oftentimes he did. He went and saw the women worshiping down by the riverside. He went to them. Rich women leaders. Not everybody went to the women. Women in the Greco-Roman world typically didn't get that kind of respect. He goes to Athens, and he ends up going to the Areopagus, and he sees an idol, or sees an altar to an unknown god, and he quotes their poets, and he says, "Well, this unknown god, that's the one I'm talking about." And so every time he did it differently. Every time he took a look and built something new and fresh, depending upon the context. Now, if you want to fail in ministry, if you want to fail miserably, if you want to waste your life and get nothing done, copy what somebody else is doing, or try to copy it. Okay? Try to copy what somebody else is doing in their setting that's working so very well. Try to copy how your home church did it. Try to copy how things are done where you come from, the right way. If you do that in a cross-cultural urban setting, I can't tell you might fail. I will tell you, having watched hundreds of people come to this city and fail, that you will fail. You're completely wasting your time. If you don't study it, if you don't study the people and the cultures and the city and understand the context, you will fail miserably. If you don't take the time to build relationships, if you think you know how to do ministry, you will fail. If you think you'll take this class and magically have the answers, no, what I'm trying to teach you guys from the get-go is to teach you how to begin to look for the answers. I can't tell you how North Minneapolis works. I can tell you what I've learned in 30 years in South Minneapolis, and I know so little compared to what there is to know. Okay? All right. Now, looking at your sheet here, so what we're going to talk about is how to start on bare dirt and build a simple ministry that works. Okay? You don't need money. You don't need permission. You don't need a lot of people. You don't need a 501c3. You don't need a budget. You just need Jesus and an idea, but you need to do that understanding a context and listening, okay? Now, a key concept in the way that I'm suggesting you do ministry is this. Everybody has something you can give away without cost that somebody else desperately needs. You are resource rich. You speak English. You know how to drive a car. You know how to run a computer. You know how the buses work, or you know the street system. You might know how to milk a cow if you live in western Wisconsin. You have all kinds of things. Even if you don't have thousands of dollars in your bank account and power and all sorts of other things, you already, if you're 18, 19, 20, or 70, have so many things that you have that other people desperately need that you can give away without cost. I could stand out on the street corner and I could hand out $20 bills till I ran out. It wouldn't take long. I only have one of them with me. But if I had $100,000 in $20 bills, if I passed out $20 bills, it wouldn't accomplish anything. That's not what the need is. People certainly would you mind having a $20 bill? Would you like a $20 bill? Can't have one. That's my emergency money. But but the answer is dealing with coming down to the root problem, a root need, and where God has prepared you with something that you can use, a tool that you can use to give yourself away. And that's one of the easiest ways to enter into ministry. You don't have to be full-time. You don't have to have a seminary degree. You don't have to be a pastor disaster. You can just be you. And that's what your life is about. The parable of the talents, right? That has been, I didn't set out to have it, but that's been kind of the main biblical concept in my life. You know, guy goes away and he gives one person 10 talents, another person 5 talents, one person 1 talent, and comes back. You know the story. You've been given an awful lot. You've been given more than any other group of people in the history of the world. Transportation, communication tools, people around you from every country, and if you just absolutely had to go to another country, somehow you could pull together $1,000 for a plane ticket. Some could put it on your credit card. Some you'd have to sell everything you had or go to some friends and beg from them, but it's possible. It's possible. Unheard of even 50 years ago, but okay. So everybody's got something that they can give away without cost that somebody desperately needs. Now, a leader, we want to teach you to be a leader. What's a leader? Somebody who sees what needs to be done and says, let's do this. That's all it takes. I watched a video today. I was goofing around on my phone, which I spent way too much time on, and I hit a video of someone who had lit a LP tank on fire. And this is, as it started on fire, they built a fire around this big LP tank, something that's 10 feet long and so forth, one of those big eggy dealies. And as it got hotter, it shot. The pressure got to be too great, and it shot the stuff out, and big flame, and then died back down again. And this went through several sequences of that. But gradually, as the excess pressure got boiled off, the tank itself had less fluid, less liquid in it, and gradually the tank then got hotter and hotter and hotter. And with the pressure and the compromised heat, it blew. It blew catastrophically. It was quite dramatic, a big, fireball going up 50 feet in the air and so on. But you can create a flame like that. It doesn't take a whole LP tank. It takes a spark. It just takes a spark. And God has given you the ability to spark what God needs to have done in the world around you. And the power and the ability and everything that you need is right there. There are all kinds of tools, and you start coming together with a group of friends, and maybe you even pull in a church or an organization with you. All of a sudden, you're talking about all sorts of resources. When we get brand new seminary students, when we've gotten brand new seminary students here, I love to sit them down and say, "Okay, listen, you're 22 years old. You're going to come out of this program in 4 years. You're going to be 26 years old, and some foolish congregation is going to come to you and say, here's about $1 million, $1.5 million in assets. Go have fun. See what you can build with this." And they kind of go. You can't hardly even believe, if you were to start sitting down and all of the assets of relationships and friends and educations and relatives and all the rest of it, you are asset rich, and God has called you at this time to be a builder, all right? So we talked about Paul the entrepreneur. That's the first blank. Okay. So the reason for this course, as I said, is to teach you to build cross-cultural, to build a ministry cross-culturally. And our purpose is to teach Christians to build and lead cross-cultural ministry. So ministry cross-culturally, that's what we're going to be learning about. All right? Now, your job, your goal is going to be to create a ministry what happened with all this here? Yeah. All right. Is to create a vision and build it. All right? So first thing, as we go, we want to understand God's leading. We want to understand what is God leading you towards. And as a young person, as you're learning with your gifts and so on, or if you've never thought about entrepreneuring, God has created you exactly as you are. God has given you the gifts exactly as you are, and every gift you have is something God can use. I have a drawer full of pocket knives at home. Yes, this is another illustration. I have a drawer of pocket knives at home. Like this one is a real minimalist one. This is really handy if you're in a foreign country or something, and I use a pocket knife a dozen times a day, probably, opening up packages, letters, trimming my fingernails, etc. I have them all the way out to I have one Swiss Army knife that's a computer Swiss Army knife that you can take computers apart with. That's this thick. It's a whopper. And yet, you know, on that Swiss Army knife, every tool, oh, look what I got here. I got a little multi-tool here. There's all kinds of good things in there. Screwdriver blade and an awl and a fingernail file. This is different from my Leatherman, and it's different from my Swiss Army knife. But every tool has a purpose. And what do you got there? Swiss Army knife? Oh, you got a little gizmo knife. Yeah. Now, do you use the fingernail file or the screwdriver to file to open a letter, or do you use they've each got their own purpose, right? Yeah, and each of you are your own Swiss Army knife. You've got your own stuff, okay? Your own gifts, your own gifting, your own ability. So first we're gonna be understanding, and this is the outline of the course. We're gonna be talking about trying to figure out the God thing of the call and what God says and what does Scripture say. Then we're going to talk about the context, the situation that you find yourself in. And then we're going to talk about the people thing, inventorying your building materials and your gifts the gifts of the workers and communicating all the people stuff, okay? So, the God thing, the context thing, and then all the people stuff. So, what we want you to do is to teach you to stay engaged in that vision with appropriate course corrections without losing your direction. Now that's the trick. It's real easy to get shiny object to get distracted in ministry. And I've known ministries that were doing really, really well, and somebody came up with what just seemed to be a great idea, but didn't have anything to do with what they were doing, and it was just obviously a bunny trail. But sometimes when you're in the midst of stuff, you don't recognize a bunny trail. Or sometimes you hit a brick wall. Oh, in the city, you hit brick walls all the time. It's kind of like a Roadrunner cart. You know how the road, you know, there's a big rock, and Wile E. Coyote paints a tunnel on there. And the Roadrunner comes, beep, beep, and he goes right through the tunnel, goes right through the wall. And then Wiley speeds up to take after him, and he hits the rock, and it turns out to be a rock. Well, somehow the Roadrunner didn't have that problem. Well, in ministry, there's a lot of times when that rock wall or that brick wall, as you keep pushing on it, as you get up closer to it, will turn into tissue paper. If we were to start and spend the next couple weeks, night after night, talking about all the times we've seen God, we've come to a place where it was impossible. One of the Lord of the Rings movies, they can't go over the top of the mountain. They need to go through the mountain, which turns out to be a real bad choice. And there's this octopus type thing in the water, and it's eating the ponies, and it's getting into all kinds of problems. And there's an ancient inscription, and it says, "To open this door, speak, friend." And they try all kinds of passwords, and Gandalf tries stuff, and finally he says, "Friend," and it opens right up. Well, unfortunately, I think that's when they ran into the Balrog, wasn't it? But yeah, but hopefully you won't run into Balrogs. Yeah. So, but the idea here is that you will find in ministry so many times, especially in the city with the spiritual stuff going on and the chaos, you will hit things that seem to be completely impossible. And you have to have the tenacity to work through them. You know, we'll maybe talk about some of those further on. So, okay, so we're now halfway through the first page. Get that? All right. So, course corrections without losing your vision. And that's a challenge as well. So that's what we're talking about. All right. This is a very fast introduction. I'm covering this stuff pretty fast, but we're going to cover all this stuff as we go on. All right. Now, what we have set on as a model is that we find that Christian ministry biblically has three parts. And I've laid this out for you before. But the central thing, the reason that the way that God has broken into humankind has been by coming and proclaiming promises. When God comes to Abram in the 10th chapter, or the 12th chapter of Genesis, and comes with 7 promises that shape all the rest of human history, including now, and then reaffirms it in chapter 13. Is that where he comes and takes the walk between the dead animals? I always get those numbers mixed up. Where he takes the loser's walk and he binds himself by blood to humankind forever. That's the cross, 1,800 years before. God comes with promises. In the New Testament, in the Old Testament, that's called chesed. We'll talk about that. And the chesed love of God comes and breaks in the nature of God. Paul translates that word chesed as grace. John uses agape love, only uses grace in the first chapter, never uses it again. Doesn't need to. All he needs is agape. And again, our relationship of response, Abraham believed God and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. And that is described later as being chesed. God's chesed creates our chesed in the Old Testament. The New Testament, they run them all kinds of different words. God's grace, God's love creates our response of trust, of faith, as well as agape love of God. But God breaks in, and this faith comes from hearing, and it comes from the promises. Gospel is promise, promise is gospel. It's always centered on the cross. We'll talk about that more next semester. But gospel proclamation, God breaking into the world to bring humanity back to himself, that's the key thing, that is the key function of the church. That's why Jesus came and died. Everything is about the cross, all right? Anybody have any questions about that? Comments? If we lose gospel proclamation, we lose the ball game. We might as well be the Boy Scouts or the Unitarians. Okay, but the gospel proclamation, as important as it is, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a real world that's full of human needs, desperate human needs. And when you're dealing with immigrants, when you're dealing with city, you're going to end up with incredible human needs. And these needs in the urban setting are the same pretty much all around the globe. Chemical dependency, hunger, educational needs, sanitation, all kinds of needs that are the same in Minneapolis as they are in Kuala Lumpur. Now, so you've got gospel proclamation in the midst of human needs, and it's best transmitted through relationships. And that's the tripartite model that we talk about. And when the church gets that right historically, the church is healthy. Now, if we have just gospel proclamation and human needs, well, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's the old soup kitchen, soup, supper, soap, and sermon, the old rescue mission on Skid Row. Some lives are changed. People were reached and touched. But if they aren't there, and if they don't build relationship, and they don't do the discipling, well, it maybe didn't bring the long-term change that, or affected people as greatly as they would hoped. If you've got gospel proclamation and relationships, well, that's friendship evangelism. And boy, in my lifetime, there have been all kinds of books on that, and I think that's one of the things you guys with Crusade Crew probably talk about the importance of that and discipling people and relationships, right? And then human needs in context, human needs in that context, building relationships, that's good social work. If you actually take the time to care about people and love people and take care, teach them and build them just with their physical needs. You know, social workers, government social workers, school social workers, they can do a great deal of good, but it doesn't affect their relationship with God, and it doesn't give the greatest gift we've got, which is Jesus. But if we take all three of these and overlap them, right in the middle looks like a guitar pick, well, that's holistic ministry, and that's what we need to redevelop in the church. Now, we'll talk next semester a little bit about this, but the mainline church, starting with the social gospel after the turn of the last century, they went deep into this at best, but they left this, they took this for granted, or they forgot it entirely and just went with secular care. And that's like having a toolbox but leaving out your most important tool. So, all right, so this is our model, and I hope that you'll have this in the back of your mind, because you can start at any of those circles. You can start with a human need, and you can use it to build a relationship and bring the gospel. You can start with sharing the gospel and building a relationship, and then seeing what the needs are of the people and discipling them. You can start with a relationship, a friendship with somebody, and you can help them along with their needs, and you can bring the gospel. It works all the way, you can start at any of the three. There's no one way that you're going to do ministry any more than Paul did. This is getting comfortable. It's almost as good as my deer stand. I'm getting this figured out. Okay. So we're going to talk about a three-part ministry, and we're going to talk about people. Okay, so if we've got this ministry, okay, so we looked at this ministry, gospel proclamation, human needs, and relationships. Okay, so that's the theological piece behind it, but let's take a look at, there's a three-part ministry in people themselves, which, oddly enough, the very nature of the biblical picture of people, that's a people, by the way, you've got, what are the three parts of the Trinity? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay. Well, the Spirit is that which works through the gospel proclamation. Faith comes from hearing. What is heard is the preaching of Christ. The gospel is the power of God, Paul says in Romans 1. So the Spirit is always there. Jesus says, "The word that I have," this is John 6, "the word that I have spoken to you is spirit and life." And some Bibles give that a small s, and some Bibles give it a big S. Having spent the last 40 years of my life studying the Gospel of John and teaching it, let me just tell you that anytime you see the word Spirit in the Gospel of John, it refers to the Holy Spirit. So the word that I have spoken to you is spirit and life. So gospel proclamation is the work of the Spirit. Now, the body, okay, so the Spirit in humans is the thing that is the Spirit of God with the gospel proclamation. That's where this fits, is in the spirit of people with the Spirit of God bringing that. The body, mind, and spirit is the human trinity, and the body has human needs. You know, if you hold your breath for 6 minutes, you're dead. You've got to have water within 3 days or you'll die. I've seen one person go 4 days. And finally, you've got the mind, and the mind has relationships. So body, mind, spirit, or body, this Greek word is psyche. We get our word psychology, or soul, as it's translated sometimes. All of who we are mentally, our emotions, our creativity, our thoughts, our memories, all of that is our psyche. The spirit is the God hole that's dead until the Holy Spirit comes and fills it. And the body, well, that's pretty obvious what that is. So so the gospel proclamation deals with the spirit, human needs deal with the body, and relationships deal with the mind. Oh, so the example we had here, all of a sudden we see that we've got this ministering to the spirit, this ministering to the body, this ministering to the mind. Okay, so let's go on from there. So we talk about God. I'm sorry, I got mixed up before. Jesus himself is the Word, and he comes to us as gospel proclamation. Now this is switched around from the other. You'd think, well, if it's spirit back here, well, then that must be what the Holy Spirit does. Well, no, because it's the Word. Jesus is the Word made flesh. And so Jesus, when we tell the story of Jesus, when we tell the promises, Jesus himself shows up. He is there. Now we can discuss, yes, the Holy Spirit takes that. Holy Spirit indwells that. But Jesus is the center. Jesus is the Word made flesh. And he comes to us always and faithfully in that scripture. Human needs, well, that's the work of the Father, the Creator, the provider. He is the one that provides and has created everything and continues to sustain us. The Holy Spirit is the one that works in the church to create the holy Christian church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. So Jesus is the center of gospel proclamation. When we're talking about the work of creation and when there's need, well, there we're talking about the work, the first article stuff, the work of, I believe in God the Father, Almighty Maker of heaven and earth, and then the Holy Spirit is the work of the relationships. So each time we take a look at this work of the Trinity show up, and this pattern keeps showing up. We've got body, mind, and spirit. We've got proclamation, human need, and relationships, and then we start taking a look at the work of the Trinity, and same thing. All right, so the biblical model, as we've said, is this one. And that's what we want to talk about through this entire course, is how do we go about building a ministry that doesn't ignore any of those? Okay? All right, where are we at in your sheet here? About on the first page, okay. Yep, okay. All right. So if these are part of our structure, ways we can think about how this all comes together, let's talk about, well, that's what we said again. We've got the God thing in context, and we're working with people. So these are the three parts of the course. First, we're going to talk about what God wills. Then we're going to talk about reading the context. And then we're going to talk about working with all the various people and how we go about doing that. We'll get to that point, okay? And those three pieces, God's promises, God's word, in the context, with people, that makes up ministry. It's just funny how these little Venn diagrams of threes just keep coming up and coming up and coming up, all right? So, again, to go back, we're going to first work on understanding God's leading, then we're going to talk about understanding the situation, and then we're going to inventory your building materials and the gifts of your workers and so forth. Now, it is now 25 after, and I had wanted to give you some time to work with your groups. How are your groups doing as far as your ministry evaluation? Have you had contact with your ministry yet? Okay, how many groups do we have here? Okay, so your group has made contact, okay, and your group has made contact, and who are you working with? Okay, and so you got a time set up with Michael yet? We are not worthy. Okay, good work. All right, you guys, how are you doing? Who are you meeting with?
We were all at Spy House, and then Chris just said his calendar betrayed him and he didn't make it. So yeah, lovely coffee. Yeah, we met because I texted him. I said I'll be in traffic and I'll be there in about 5 minutes.
And which ministry is that?
Salt.
Salt. We just didn't spank enough when he was young. Okay, okay.
Well, and then we
All right.
Like, oh, I'll be there in 5 minutes, but he hadn't saved my name as me, so he thought it was Chris texting him. So he's like, oh, he'll be here soon. He'll be here soon. He'll be here soon. And then half an hour goes by. You might want to call him. Oh, sorry, I forgot. So we're gonna meet this week or next week. But.
Okay. Okay, good. All right, well, then I guess we don't need to spend a lot of time. Sounds like you're already ahead of you guys are really good. Good. I'm sorry that happened. One thing you'll learn about urban ministry is that there's just a whole lot of chaos. And I'm amazed that did you guys have any trouble getting a hold of your people? Okay, good. Most normally, when people try to get a hold of somebody in ministry and get an okay or set up a meeting, they're just absolutely flabbergasted as to how hard it is to get communication back and forth and back and forth, and people returning phone calls. It's good that we're not doing this as close to Christmas as we have in the past, because that's big fundraising time, as is, where I guess we've started that already now. Okay, so next week we're going to come in at this point. This is the underlying piece, and we're going to talk specifically about each of these three sections. Okay, does that make sense? If you feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose, it's because you are. I'm trying to give you a lifetime of building experience in a few hours, but we'll go back, and if you think about questions, if questions come to mind, pencil them in, and we can talk about it afterwards or whatever. So, you want to give us a report about the Miss Minnesota pageant? What was it like?
Thanks. Like, what do you want to know? What was it like? Well, there wasn't a talent competition. There's two different. There's Miss USA and there's Miss America. So Miss USA is what I was, the company that I was for or going through, and so it was Miss USA does a swimsuit competition instead of talent, and then Miss America does the talent instead of swimsuit. So it's a little bit different in those areas. But yeah, so I was through Miss USA, but yeah, it was really good. I'm actually having a Facebook Live tonight at 10 to talk about it, and then talk about what now is after this and what's next in the next chapter that kind of is opening up right now for me. So yeah, so that's cool. And then talking about like different things that happened this weekend that were cool ministry opportunities, and like kind of what like started a spark in my head. And then, yeah, I placed top 5 in 2 categories, and then top 10 in the third category. So that was pretty cool. That was like kind of unheard of for a first-year pageant person, so that's cool. Bragging rights, I guess. It's really awkward. That was the top 10 one. I wasn't confident.
Me neither.
Yeah. Well, you probably would have done better than me, honestly. No, it was really good. It was a really good learning experience, and there was 4 other girls that were believers there, so that was really cool too, to get in community with other girls that have the same kind of vision as me. Well, Fergus Falls, but not really. Like you basically just apply, and then so hundreds of girls applied, and they chose 44 out of those hundreds of girls to represent different regions of Minnesota. So then we all, went to compete. But no, it wasn't like I wasn't like Miss Fergus Falls or anything. So yeah, nothing like that. But yeah, I got accepted, and that's yeah. Yeah, super cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, folks, we've run over. So, work on your stuff. Thank you. Got your presentations today. We're insightful. Good. Father, watch over us, protect us, and please watch over the people down south that are dealing with the blizzard and stuff. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.